My name was Kenji Takagi. I spent 14 years mastering Eternal Abyss, a game famed for its cruelty. Now, I am Rio, a 5-year-old orphan in a world that feels suspiciously like that game's legendary difficulty. There is no interface, no health bar, just the gnawing hunger and the weakness of a child's body. An old woman, Elena, found me. She gives me scraps of food and a place to sleep. It is my starting zone, and she is my one and only non-player character. My class, Summoner, is a cruel joke. The slot for a familiar is empty, a void in my soul. My stats are abysmal. Strength maybe 2, endurance 3. I am the definition of a level 1 trash mob, waiting to be farmed for experience. But a gamer's mind is a weapon. This is not a tragedy, it is the ultimate challenge. A hardcore run with 1 life and 0 continues. The objective is simple: survive day 1, then optimize, then dominate. The first year was pure data collection. I started by carrying water from the well. Each trip was a quest. 10 trips a day. I felt my childish muscles ache, a physical confirmation that my endurance was slowly ticking up. My payment was a bowl of thin soup. I calculated the caloric intake versus the energy expended. It was a losing trade, but the stat points were the real profit. This was an investment in my future capital. Next was wood chopping. The axe was heavy, my swings clumsy. But each successful chop felt like a point in strength. The villagers watched the silent orphan work without complaint, a bizarre sight they could not comprehend. Elena worried, but she saw the determination in my eyes. She did not stop me. She thought I was traumatized into silence. In reality, I was in a state of maximum focus, grinding in the only dungeon available to me. By age 7, my routine was a well-oiled machine. 50 trips to the well for endurance. 20 logs split for strength. My body was still a child's, but it was wiry and far stronger than it should have been. I added a new grind to my schedule. Intellect. I would hide near the village center, listening to the merchants and the baron's tax collectors. I learned the local economy, the value of grain, and the name of our oppressor. Every overheard conversation was an experience point. The world's hidden mechanics started to reveal themselves. The Baron was not just a ruler, he was a resource drain, a system designed to keep us weak and impoverished. My mental ledger was meticulous. I estimated my stats: strength 12, endurance 15, agility maybe 8 from dodging the village bully. My growth was slow, pathetic by game standards, but it was real and it was mine. Then, at age 9, the system's pressure intensified. The Baron doubled the grain tax. There was no reason, just a whim of power. The village, already on the brink, began to starve. This was a world event, a debuff applied to my entire zone. Elena was the first to suffer. Her old body could not handle the reduced rations. I watched her health decline, a slow, agonizing drain I was powerless to stop. I tried to give her my food, but she refused. I calculated her chances, a 30% reduction in caloric intake over 2 months for a person her age. The probability of survival was less than 5%. My rage was not hot, it was a cold, hard number. She died on a cold morning. It was not a dramatic scene, just a quiet end. For me, it was the failure of a primary quest. Protect the non-player character. I had failed. A new quest was generated instantly: vengeance. The Baron was no longer just a system, he was a target. My grind changed. It was no longer for survival, it was for war. I pushed my 10-year-old body past its limits, the pain a currency I was happy to spend. I ate less, worked more. I ran laps around the village perimeter at night, pushing my endurance and agility. I practiced with a sharpened stick, my future weapon skill. I was forging a hero out of a starving orphan. The villagers now feared me. They saw a boy who did not mourn, who only worked with a chilling, mechanical intensity. They saw the cold fire in my eyes and kept their distance. I had become an anomaly in their simple lives. The breaking point arrived on my 10th birthday. The Baron sent his enforcer, a creature they called the Pacifier. It was a massive, tusked beast, a low-level field boss sent to remind us of our place. Screams echoed through the village. The 2 men who acted as guards were swatted aside like insects. Their health bars, if they had them, had hit 0 instantly. I watched from the shadows, analyzing the beast's attack patterns. Its movements were slow but powerful. A charge attack, a cleave, and a stomp. Standard boss mechanics. But for level 1 villagers, it was an apocalypse. There was no strategy that could overcome this gear check. My plan was to hide, to wait it out, but the Pacifier's path was random, destructive. It smashed the hut where Elena had lived, and its gaze fell upon me. Its aggro was locked. My stealth stat was too low. I ran. My agility was higher than any other child's, but I was still just a child. The beast crashed through walls behind me, its roars shaking the ground. I was a mouse fleeing a dragon. The outcome was preordained. I found myself trapped in a dead-end alley, a solid stone wall behind me, a 2-ton monster in front. I ran the calculations. My chance of survival was 0. There was no escape route, no environmental advantage. This was it. Game over. I faced the beast, my sharpened stick held tight. I felt the primal, gut-wrenching fear of a true death. It was a sensation no game could ever replicate. It was absolute. And in that moment of pure terror, my gamer's mind, the one that had faced 1,000 digital deaths, found a strange calm. I accepted my fate. It was a good run for a level 1, a perfect fusion of fear and acceptance. The trigger condition was met. A voice, cold and genderless, echoed in my skull. True fear and the acceptance of death have been confirmed. Activating the summoner class. A shadow detached from my own. It rose, forming into a creature of living darkness, a fox with 9 flowing tails and eyes that held the emptiness of the void. My first familiar. The pacifier roared, charging at the impossible creature. The void fox did not move. It did not attack. It simply opened its eyes, and a wave of pure nothingness washed over the beast. The pacifier did not even have time to scream as it dissolved into fine gray dust. The village was silent, their terror of the monster replaced by a new, more profound fear of me. The voice in my head spoke again. Familiar acquired void fox. Rank hidden. Skill unlocked. Eye of the Abyss. I activated the skill instinctively. My vision shifted and the world became a sea of data. I looked at the dirt beneath my feet, and the Eye of the Abyss showed me its true nature. It was not dirt. It was a thin layer hiding a vast, rich vein of shadow ore, a resource of immense value. And I knew instantly that the Baron was not just cruel, he was systematically starving us to buy this land for nothing. This was not just a village, it was a treasure chest, and I had just found the key. The dust settled, revealing the shocked faces of the villagers. They weren't looking at the spot where the monster died, but at me. I was no longer the orphan. I was a monster who killed monsters. My void fox melted back into my shadow, its presence a cool weight. I had to control the narrative immediately. A 10-year-old boy controlling a void beast is a target. A boy who miraculously survived is a hero. I staggered, feigned exhaustion, and pointed at the sky. A divine miracle, I mouthed to the village elder. They needed a simple explanation, not the truth of a game-like system. They bought it. For now. The immediate crisis was over, but the strategic one had just begun. The village had less than a month's worth of grain. The winter was coming. The shadow ore was my only path to victory, but I couldn't dig it myself. The Eye of the Abyss was my new user interface for reality. As I walked, it fed me data. This patch of weeds has minor healing properties. That tree's bark is a natural anesthetic. The world was full of untapped resources. I focused on low-hanging fruit first. I had the Void Fox, now named Keg, meaning shadow. Use its senses to locate a patch of sunsettle herbs. My intellect told me merchants paid a good price for them in the city. I collected a small bundle. The Eye of the Abyss confirmed their properties. Increases health regeneration by 10% for 1 hour. I gave them to the village healer, claiming I found them by a miracle. Her awe was my reward. This act served 2 purposes. It solidified my miracle narrative and provided a tangible benefit to the village, increasing my reputation stat. My current standing was probably neutral suspicious. I needed to raise it to trusted. But herbs wouldn't solve the food crisis. I needed to start mining. The problem was tools. The village had maybe 5 rusted pickaxes and 10 shovels. Their durability was practically 0. They would break on the shadow ore. I needed a blacksmith. More than that, I needed a loyal subordinate. I scanned the villagers with my eye. Most were useless, their stats too low, their loyalty questionable. But there were a few with potential. My gaze fell on 3 men. The village's best hunter, a young man named Kale. The retired blacksmith, Ilara. And a quiet farmer, Borin, who was stronger than he looked. These were my potential party members. I had to recruit them carefully. I couldn't reveal my system. I had to offer them something they couldn't refuse. For Kale, it was a better hunt. For Ilara, a purpose. For Borin, a full stomach for his family. I approached Borin first. He was the most desperate. His children were thin. I offered him double rations of food for a week's worth of secret work. He didn't ask questions. Desperation is a powerful motivator. The work was simple. Dig a new, deeper root cellar under my old hut. It was a cover. The real target was the shadow ore vein directly underneath. The risk of discovery was high, maybe 35%. We worked at night. Boren dug, and I used Keg to muffle the sound and carry away the dirt. The fox's void nature could absorb sound waves to a degree. My first attempt at stealth mechanics in this new world. The first pickaxe broke within 10 minutes. As expected, the raw shadow ore was incredibly dense. Boren looked at me, his face a mask of despair. We had no way to mine this miracle rock. This was my moment. I pulled out a small, rough chunk of ore I had Keg secretly break off. I told Boren it was a blessed stone. We needed to show it to Alara, the old blacksmith. He was the only one who could unlock its power. Boren, clutching the ore, ran to Alara's forge. The old man hadn't worked in years, ever since the Baron's taxes made his craft unprofitable. He was a bitter, broken man. His skill tree was dormant. I watched from a distance. I saw Alara take the ore, his eyes widening. I saw him light his forge for the first time in a decade. The Eye of the Abyss showed me a new status effect on him. Hope renewed. The next day, Alara called for me. He held up a reforged pickaxe head. It glowed with a faint, dark energy. He had embedded tiny fragments of the shadow ore into the iron. It was a crude enchantment, but it was a start. The system gave me a notification in my mind. New item crafted. Shadow-infused pickaxe. Durability plus 200%. Efficiency plus 50%. The numbers were beautiful. My economic engine was starting to turn. We now had a tool. The cost was one piece of shadow ore and the loyalty of one blacksmith. The return on investment was a 50% increase in our mining speed. A solid trade. Boren, armed with the new pickaxe, went back to work. The difference was night and day. He could now break off fist-sized chunks of ore with each swing. Our production rate had gone from nearly 0 to 10 units per night. This created a new problem: logistics. We now had a growing pile of magical ore under my hut. We had to store it, hide it, and eventually transport it. Every solution created 3 new problems. This was the core gameplay loop. I tasked Boren with reinforcing the cellar, turning it into a hidden vault. He used the normal stone and clay we were digging up to mask the entrance and line the walls. His strength stat was increasing daily from the hard labor. Meanwhile, I focused on Kale, the hunter. His problem was simple. The forest was dangerous and his gear was poor. His kill rate was low. He was risking his life for meager returns. A classic low-level grind. I approached him not with ore, but with information. I used the Eye of the Abyss to track a pack of dire wolves. I found their den, their patrol routes, and their leader's weakness. A previously healed leg injury. I gave Kale a detailed map. I told him it came to me in a divine vision. Attack the alpha from its left side. Use a pit trap here, and coat your arrows in this sap I found. It causes paralysis. Kale was skeptical. He was a man of action, not faith. But he was also desperate. The village needed meat. He agreed to try my plan, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. My reputation was on the line. The next day, Kale returned. He was not just successful. He had brought back the entire pack. 6 wolves, including the alpha. The village would eat for weeks. Kale looked at me with a new expression. It was not doubt. It was awe. This was the first true face slap moment. The entire village saw the results. The silent orphan boy had produced a miracle. My reputation jumped from trusted to revered. My social engineering was working perfectly. Kale became my second loyal subordinate. He pledged his service to me, the boy who spoke with the gods. I now had a miner and a hunter, a production unit and a security unit. My guild was forming. The influx of meat solved the immediate food crisis. It also gave me a new resource: wolf pelts and teeth. The Eye of the Abyss told me they had minor magical properties. They were crafting materials. I brought the pelts to Alara. I also gave him another chunk of shadow ore. I told him to create something for Kale, something to make him a more effective guardian for our village. Alara worked for 2 days straight, his forge burning through the night. He emerged, exhausted but triumphant, holding a short sword and a set of leather armor. They were infused with shadow ore and reinforced with wolf bone. The system notified me again. Shadow weave leather armor. Physical defense plus 30. Stealth plus 10. Dire wolf fang sword. Damage plus 25. Inflicts bleeding effect. This was my first set of rare gear. I presented the gear to Kale. He was speechless. He had never held such a fine weapon. He was now not just a hunter. He was an elite warrior by this village's standards. My investment in him was already paying off. His loyalty was now absolute. I had given him power, status, and the means to protect his people. I had a commander for my future army. My plan was escalating from survival to the creation of a military force. With Kale handling security and hunting, and Borin handling the mining, I could focus on the bigger picture, the shadow ore. What was its true value? How could I convert it into real power? I used the Eye of the Abyss on the ore again, pushing the skill to its limit. I saw more than its density. I saw its potential. It could absorb and store energy. It could be used to create magical items, not just infused ones. This was the key. This was the resource that would let me break the game. The Baron thought he was sitting on a simple mine. He was sitting on the equivalent of a uranium deposit in the Stone Age, and he had no idea. But I had a new, urgent problem. The smell of the cooked wolf meat would travel. The sudden prosperity of a starving village would be noticed. The Baron's spies were surely already on their way. I calculated the timeline. We had maybe 2 weeks before a tax collector arrived, a month before the Baron himself took notice. We had to work faster. I increased Borin's rations and had him hire 2 other trusted men. Our mining operation expanded. We were now producing 30 units of shadow ore per night. Our hidden vault was half full. The risk of discovery increased with every new person involved. The operational security was my top priority. I had Kale establish a perimeter. He used his new stealth gear to patrol the woods, looking for scouts. He was my early warning system. He was the first line of defense for my budding criminal enterprise. Alara's role also shifted. He was no longer just a blacksmith. He was my research and development department. I had him experiment with the ore, trying to create more potent alloys and enchantments. He discovered that by grinding the ore into a fine powder and mixing it with oil, he could create a paste that, when applied to a weapon, gave it a temporary shadow damage buff. My first consumable item. The village was changing. People were healthier, stronger. They looked to me as their savior. The village elder was now my mouthpiece, spreading the tale of the miracle boy. My control over the local population was nearly total, but this success was a double-edged sword. It was a beacon. It was a giant signpost for the Baron that said something is wrong here. I was painting a target on my own back. I needed a way to launder our newfound wealth. I couldn't just start building new houses. The Baron would demand to know where the money came from. I needed an economic cover story. The solution came from Kale's hunting. The dire wolf pelts were valuable. I had Alara treat them with a special alchemical solution I designed using my eye's analysis of local plants. It made them tougher and darker. We started a new village industry, cured shadow pelts. It was a believable source of income. We could claim we had found a new way to cure leather, a secret technique. It was a perfect lie. I sent the village elder to the nearest town with a cart of these pelts. The goal was not just to sell them, but to establish a trade route and gather intelligence. He was my first merchant and diplomat. He returned a week later with a pouch full of silver and information. The pelts had sold for a fortune, and the Baron was indeed sending an investigator. He was due to arrive in 3 days. The timer had started. We had 3 days to hide everything. The mining operation had to be shut down. The vault had to be perfectly concealed. All the shadow ore-infused items had to be hidden. We had to look like a poor but lucky village of hunters. The tension was immense. One mistake, one loose tongue, and we were all dead. I drilled the villagers on the cover story. We were blessed by the forest spirit. That was the official narrative. The investigator arrived. He was a smug, well-fed man with cruel eyes. He was not a warrior. He was a bureaucrat. His primary weapon was suspicion. I used my Eye of the Abyss on him. The system revealed his stats. Low strength, low endurance, but his perception was high. And he had a hidden trait, greed. This was his weakness. I could exploit this. This was a social boss battle. I had the elder greet him with a feast of roasted wolf meat. We showed him the high-quality pelts. We played the part of simple, grateful villagers perfectly. He was unimpressed. He was looking for a secret source of gold. He started searching houses, looking for hidden wealth. He found nothing. We were genuinely poor, except for our one hidden resource. He grew frustrated. His suspicion was turning to anger. Then I made my move. I had Kale stage a small accident. A cart of the cured pelts overturned right in front of the investigator. Among them was one special pelt. It had a small, polished shadow ore gem sewn into it, disguised as a button. The investigator's eyes locked onto the gem. His greed trait flared. He pocketed the gem when he thought no one was looking. But I was looking. I had him. He had taken a bribe, even if he didn't know it. He left the next day. His report to the Baron would be simple. The village got lucky with a good hunt. Their new leather curing technique is profitable, but nothing more. He would omit the gem, his own little secret. We were safe, for now. The cost of this victory was 1 unit of shadow ore, crafted into a gem by Alara, a small price to pay for buying us more time. But I knew this was just the first wave. The pressure would only increase. We resumed the mining operation, but with more caution. I knew we couldn't hide in this village forever. We needed to expand. We needed to build a real base, a real fortress. My starting zone was becoming too small. I stood on the hill overlooking the village. The people were working, eating, even laughing. I had saved them from starvation. I had given them hope. But I was also leading them into a war they couldn't possibly comprehend. My next step was to arm them. Alara's experiments were progressing. He could now forge crude but effective weapons from a low-grade shadow ore alloy. We could create our own militia. The economics were simple. 1 set of armor and a sword cost 20 units of shadow ore. I had 100 villagers. That was 2,000 units of ore. Our current production was 30 per night. It would take over 2 months. Time was a resource I did not have. The Baron was not a fool. The investigator's report would satisfy him for a while, but he would eventually want a piece of our new pelt trade. He would send more men. I had to accelerate my plan. I needed to increase our mining efficiency, but that required better tools, which required more ore. It was a classic resource bottleneck. I had to find a way to break the cycle. The solution was not to dig deeper, but to think bigger. The Eye of the Abyss didn't just show me the ore. It showed me the geological structure of the entire area. The main vein was under the village, but there were smaller surface-level deposits in the forest. These deposits were too small for a major mining operation, but they were perfect for a quick, targeted extraction. I gave Kyle a new map, marking 3 of these locations. He was to lead a small team and bring back whatever he could. He returned with 50 units of ore. It was a one-time bonus, but it was enough. I gave it all to Alara. The order was simple. Don't make weapons. Make better tools. Shovels, pickaxes, chisels of the highest quality he could manage. This was a major investment. 50 units of ore for no immediate defensive gain. Boren and the others were confused. They wanted swords to fight the Baron. I gave them shovels. They thought I was mad. But when they took the new tools into the mine, they understood. The new pickaxes, made entirely from the low-grade alloy, cut through the rock like it was butter. Our mining output did not just increase, it tripled. We were now producing 90 units of shadow ore per night. The 2-month timeline for arming the village was now just 3 weeks. This was the power of investing in infrastructure. It was a lesson every strategy gamer learns. The face slap was for my own people. They saw the result and their faith in my leadership was solidified. They no longer questioned my strange decisions. They just followed. I was building not just an army, but a cult of personality. But with this new production rate came a new, more dangerous problem. We were creating too much waste rock. The piles of dirt we were hiding were becoming too large. The risk of environmental discovery was growing. We couldn't just dump it in the forest. The Baron's patrols would see the fresh earth. I needed a massive project to hide our project. I needed to build something big, something that justified moving tons of rock and dirt. I announced my next miracle. We were going to build a wall, a great stone wall to protect the village from the beasts of the forest and the bandits on the road. It was a project that everyone could get behind. The villagers cheered. They saw a wise leader protecting them. I saw the perfect cover for my secret mining operation. All the waste rock from the mine would become the foundation and filler for our new wall. The economics of it were perfect. The cost of the wall was labor, which I had in abundance. The benefit was twofold: a real defensive structure and a perfect way to hide my activities. It was a flawless strategic move. Construction began immediately. The entire village was mobilized. Men, women, and even the older children were hauling rock and digging foundations. The village was a hive of activity, and deep below, my elite team of miners worked in secret, their output now hidden by the massive construction project above. We were building our future on 2 levels, one in the light and one in the dark. But my Eye of the Abyss warned me of a new threat. It wasn't the Baron. It was something in the forest. Kale's patrols reported strange tracks and a sense of being watched by something old and intelligent. The local ecosystem was reacting to my presence. My success was attracting new, more powerful monsters. The increased production of shadow ore was a powerful advantage, but it created an imbalance in my system. My core team, Kale, Alara, and Boren, were overworked. I was the strategist, but they were the entire executive branch. This was a management problem. I couldn't oversee the mine, the forge, and the patrols simultaneously, especially with the wall construction as a cover. My own time was my most limited resource. I needed to delegate. I decided to formalize my command structure. Kale was officially promoted to Chief of Security and Huntsmaster. His duties included training a small militia, managing patrols, and gathering intelligence in the forest. Boren became the mine's foreman. He was responsible for the entire extraction operation, from managing the miners to overseeing the concealment of waste rock within the new wall's foundation. His loyalty was proven. Ilara's role expanded to quartermaster and head of research. He would not only forge weapons and tools, but also manage our growing stockpile of resources, from ore and pelts to food and medicinal herbs. This delegation freed up approximately 60% of my daily schedule. I could now focus on long-term strategy, alchemical research using the Eye of the Abyss, and most importantly, expanding my team with more specialized talent. The new threat Kale had detected in the forest became my immediate priority. My Eye of the Abyss couldn't get a clear reading from a distance. The entity was cloaked, suggesting a high stealth or magical stat. I needed better intelligence. I invested 30 units of shadow ore into a project for Ilara. The task was to create a set of listening devices. Simple cones made from a thin ore alloy that could amplify distant sounds. Ilara delivered 3 prototypes within a day. They were crude, but functional. I gave them to Kale's best scouts, positioning them at key points around the village perimeter. My intelligence network was leveling up. The reports came in quickly. The sounds were not of a beast. They were of something digging, something building. The sounds came from a cave system about 2 miles north of the village. A new dungeon was activating on my map. My analysis concluded there were 2 possibilities. A new monster was creating a lair, or a rival faction was setting up a forward operating base. Both scenarios were a direct threat to my operation. I needed to investigate personally, but I couldn't go alone. My own combat stats were still pitifully low. I was a level 1 summoner with a level 10 brain. I was the classic glass cannon without the cannon. Kale was my best warrior, but I couldn't risk him on a reconnaissance mission into an unknown threat. If he fell, our village's entire security structure would collapse. The risk versus reward was too high. I decided to recruit a new type of specialist, a scout, someone with high agility and perception who could get in, gather data, and get out without being detected. I scanned the village population again with my eye. I found a candidate, a young woman named Lyra. She was an outcast, accused of theft a year ago. Her stats were unimpressive, except for her agility, which was a surprising 16. Her hidden trait was Lightfoot. She was the perfect rogue class. I approached her at night. She was wary, defensive. She expected another accusation. Instead, I offered her a job, a chance to use her unique talents for the good of the village. My offer was simple: a full pardon for her alleged crime, a steady supply of food, and a weapon crafted by Ilara. In return, she would become my eyes and ears in the shadows, my personal intelligence agent. She was suspicious, but desperate. I sealed the deal by revealing I knew she was innocent. The Eye of the Abyss had shown me the truth of the theft. The village elder's son was the real culprit. This was a powerful social maneuver. My knowledge of her innocence broke through her defenses. She saw me not as a leader, but as someone who saw the truth. Her loyalty meter, if I had one, probably jumped from hostile to allied in a single conversation. I equipped her immediately. Ilara, on my instruction, had already crafted a prototype dagger and light leather armor from our reserves. The cost was 15 units of shadow ore, a worthwhile investment in my new agent. I gave Lyra her first mission: infiltrate the northern caves. Do not engage. Observe and report. I gave her one of Ilara's listening devices and 3 of the paralyzing sap pouches I had developed. She moved like a ghost, her Lightfoot trait making her almost invisible in the twilight. Her agility was impressive. She could traverse the forest twice as fast as Kale. I had found the perfect tool for the job. While she was gone, I focused on another pressing issue: the wall. The construction was going well, but it was just a pile of rocks. It had no real defensive capability. It needed to be upgraded. I designed a series of simple but effective additions: wooden palisades on top, a sharpened stake trench in front, and reinforced gatehouses at the 2 main entrances. This would triple its defensive rating. The project required a massive amount of wood. We didn't have the manpower to both build the wall and run a logging operation. I was facing another resource bottleneck. I needed to optimize my workforce. I solved it by creating a new work schedule. I divided the village workforce into 2 teams. One team worked on the wall's foundation while the other team felled and prepared lumber. They would switch roles every 3 days. This system prevented burnout and cross-trained the villagers in different skills. It also increased overall efficiency by 15%. According to my calculations, my management skills were definitely leveling up. Lyra returned after 2 days. She was shaken, but unharmed. Her report was chilling. The caves were not occupied by monsters. They were occupied by goblins. At least 50 of them. But they were not typical goblins. They were organized. They were building crude forges, sharpening weapons, and being led by a much larger, more intelligent hobgoblin. They were not a random spawn. They were an army in the making. This was a nightmare scenario. A goblin nest so close to the village was a ticking time bomb. Their numbers would grow, and eventually, they would attack. I had to act, and I had to act fast. A direct assault was suicide. Kale's militia consisted of 10 poorly trained farmers. We had 5 shadow weave swords and some leather armor. The goblins had 50 warriors in a fortified position. The odds were not in our favor. I needed an advantage, a way to even the odds. I spent the night analyzing Lyra's report and the map she had drawn. I looked for a weakness, an exploit I could use, and then I found it. The goblins were miners. They were expanding their caves, and Lyra reported they were digging towards a specific point. I used the Eye of the Abyss to analyze the geological data. They were digging towards a natural underground river. This was their objective, a secure water source. It was also their greatest weakness. If I could redirect that river, or even just a part of it, I could flood their entire cave system. It was a high-risk, high-reward strategy. The plan was complex. It required precise digging, a controlled demolition, and perfect timing. I needed a team of my most trusted miners and a way to create a powerful explosive. Boren and his best 5 miners were tasked with digging a new tunnel. It would intersect with the underground river upstream from the goblin caves. It was dangerous work. The risk of a cave-in was close to 40%. For the explosive, I turned to Alara and my own knowledge of alchemy. The Eye of the Abyss had identified a type of crystal in the mine that was highly unstable. When mixed with the dire wolf fat and ground shadow ore, it should create a potent explosive paste. The research and development cost was high, 20 units of shadow ore and 10 of the rare crystals. We only had a limited supply of these crystals, so we had one shot to get the formula right. Alara worked tirelessly, his forge repurposed into an alchemical lab. The first 2 test batches were failures. One fizzled out, the other flash froze. I adjusted the ratios based on my eye's analysis of the chemical reactions. The third batch was a success. We created a small, stable ball of the paste. When ignited, it produced a powerful, focused explosion, enough to shatter a large boulder. We had our bomb. The final piece of the puzzle was the diversion. I couldn't just flood the caves. I had to make sure every goblin was inside when it happened. I needed bait, and the perfect bait was me. My plan was for Kale and his militia to launch a feigned attack on the cave entrance. They would make a lot of noise, shoot a few arrows, and then retreat, drawing the goblins' attention. While the goblins were distracted, Lyra and I would sneak into their caves through a secondary entrance she had discovered. Our goal was to plant the explosive at a key structural point that would collapse the main cavern and divert the river. It was a crazy plan. The number of things that could go wrong was astronomical. If the diversion failed, we would be trapped. If the explosive was a dud, we would be facing 50 goblins in close quarters. The night of the operation arrived. The tension in the village was palpable. Everyone knew what was at stake. Kale and his 10 men, armed with our best gear, moved out towards the goblin caves. I stood with Lyra, the pack with the explosive on my back, feeling like a ton of bricks. Cage was a silent shadow at my feet, his presence a small comfort. My heart was pounding, a physical reminder that this was not a game. We heard the sounds of Kale's attack. Shouts, the clash of steel, the guttural roars of the goblins. The diversion had begun. That was our signal. We slipped into the secondary entrance, a narrow crack in the rock face. The cave was dark, damp, and smelled of goblins. We moved silently, Lyra in the lead. We could hear the sounds of the main cavern ahead, the goblins preparing to chase after Kale's retreating forces. We reached the target location, a large pillar of rock that supported the ceiling of the main chamber. The Eye of the Abyss confirmed it was the keystone. Bringing it down would cause a chain reaction. I carefully placed the explosive charge at the base of the pillar. I set a simple chemical fuse, a slow-burning cord that would give us about 5 minutes to escape. There was no room for error. As I lit the fuse, I heard a shout from behind us. A goblin patrol had found the secondary entrance. We had been discovered. Our escape route was cut off. The plan had failed at the final step. We were trapped between the burning fuse and 2 angry goblins. Lyra drew her dagger, her face pale but determined. My own combat ability was near 0. This was a scenario my calculations had not fully prepared for. I had one last option, one I had been saving. I focused all my will, all my energy, and called upon my summoner class. The requirement was not fear, but something else. Desperate resolve. My shadow pulsed and Kag emerged, but he was different. He was larger, his 9 tails tipped with a faint, ghostly light. A new skill had unlocked. Void Step. For a brief moment, he could teleport us a short distance. I grabbed Lyra as Cage's shadow enveloped us. The world dissolved into a cold, silent void for a split second. Then we reappeared, 20 feet down the tunnel, behind the shocked goblins. We didn't wait. We ran. The goblins shrieked in confusion and rage, turning to give chase. But it was too late. The fuse burned down. A low rumble shook the ground, then a deafening roar. The cave system collapsed behind us, the sound of 1,000 tons of rock and a raging river filling the air. We made it out of the entrance just as the water burst through, a muddy torrent that sealed the cave forever. We had done it. We had wiped out the entire goblin nest without losing a single person. The cost was high. 50 units of ores for tools, 30 for intelligence gear, 15 for Lyra's equipment, and 20 for the explosive. A total of 115 units. But the reward was greater. The immediate threat to the village was eliminated. We had secured our northern border, and we had successfully tested our first combined arms operation. My team had proven they could work together under pressure. Kale and his men returned, buzzing with adrenaline. Their feigned attack had been a success. They had drawn out the goblins and retreated without casualties, just as planned. Their morale was sky high. The victory was a massive boost for the entire village. They saw a tangible result of their hard work. The wall they were building was not just for show. They had a leader who could protect them from the darkness. But I knew this was just a temporary victory. The goblins were a symptom, not the disease. Something had organized them, pushed them towards our village. The true enemy was still out there, watching. I used the Eye of the Abyss on the collapsed cave. The water was still flowing, but the skill showed me something new. The goblin's magic, however crude, had left a residue, an energy signature. It was faint, but it was there. And it did not feel like the chaotic energy of goblins. It was cold, disciplined, and familiar. It was the same energy signature I had felt from the Baron's pacifier beast. The connection was clear. The Baron was not just an oppressor. He, or someone he worked for, was actively using monsters to control the region. The goblins were not a random encounter. They were a strategic move by a hidden player. This changed everything. My fight was not just against a greedy nobleman. It was against a force that could command monsters. I was no longer just building a village. I was building a fortress in the middle of a war I was only just beginning to understand. My next move had to be carefully considered. I had a secure base, a loyal team, and a steady source of a powerful resource. I had won the opening skirmish. Now, I had to prepare for the main campaign. I gathered my lieutenants, Kel, Elara, Borin, and now Lyra. I laid out the situation. I didn't tell them about the game-like system, but I told them about the connection between the goblins and the Baron. Their reaction was grim, but resolute. They had faced down starvation and monsters. They were not the same weak villagers they had been a few months ago. They were survivors. They were soldiers. We made a collective decision. We would not wait for the Baron to come to us. We would take the fight to him, but not with a direct assault. We would use espionage, economic warfare, and targeted strikes. Our first objective was to establish a true intelligence network outside the village. Lyra was the perfect agent for this. Her mission was to infiltrate the main town, the Baron's seat of power. She would pose as a refugee, a pelt trader, anything to get inside the walls. Her goal was to identify the Baron's key personnel, map out his defenses, and find the source of his monster-controlling power. This was an incredibly dangerous mission. The risk of capture was over 70%. I invested heavily in her success. Elara spent a week crafting her a new set of gear. She received a masterwork Shadow Weave armor set, a pair of perfectly balanced throwing knives, and a cloak with a minor chameleon enchantment that would help her blend into the shadows. The cost was another 40 units of ore. While she prepared, I focused on our economy. The pelt trade was a good cover, but it wasn't scalable. I needed a new product, something unique that only we could produce to generate the income needed to fund a war. The answer was in Elara's forge. He had been experimenting with the shadow or dust. He found that when fired onto pottery at a specific temperature, it created a glaze that was impossibly smooth and completely black. It was beautiful, but its real property was revealed by my eye. The glaze had a preservative effect. Food and liquid stored in these pots lasted 3 times as long. This was a game-changing technology. We had a new export, shadow-glazed pottery. It was a luxury good with a practical application. It was the perfect product to introduce to the wider market, a way to build our economic power under the guise of simple craftsmanship. We dedicated a portion of our workforce to creating the pottery. We built a new, larger kiln hidden within the village. Our little hamlet was slowly transforming into a secret industrial powerhouse. The wall was nearing completion. It was now 10 feet high and surrounded the entire village. It was a symbol of our newfound strength and defiance. It broadcast a clear message. We were no longer victims. Boren's miners had become incredibly efficient. They had cleared out the entire vein beneath the village. Our stockpile of raw shadow ore was now over 3,000 units. We had the capital to make some serious moves. Kale's militia was now 15 strong. They trained daily, their discipline forged in the goblin fight. They were armed with the first batch of shadow steel weapons from Alara's forge. They were a small but elite fighting force. Everything was falling into place. My system was working. Production, security, research, and intelligence were all operating in synergy. I had built a functioning city-state from nothing in a matter of months. The day came for Lyra to leave. I gave her a final piece of equipment, a small, polished shadow ore pendant. I told her if she was ever in mortal danger, to break it. I didn't tell her how I would know. The truth was, the pendant was linked to Kage. If it broke, my familiar would feel it. It was a crude distress beacon. It was a desperate gamble, but it was the only way I could offer her a lifeline. She disappeared into the night, a ghost heading into the heart of the enemy's territory. The fate of our entire operation now rested on her shoulders. I had given her the best gear and intelligence I could. The rest was up to her skill and luck. With Lyra gone, a new phase of my plan began. The village was now secure. The next step was to project our power outwards. The forest was full of resources, and I intended to claim them all. My Eye of the Abyss had mapped out several key locations. A grove of rare ironwood trees, a cave filled with glowing moss that could be used as a long-lasting light source, and a den of spiders whose silk was as strong as steel. These were strategic resource nodes. Controlling them would give me a massive advantage. I sent Coil and his militia to secure the Ironwood Grove first. It was the closest and most valuable. They encountered resistance. A tribe of primitive, ape-like creatures called Grokans claimed the grove as their territory. They were strong, but not intelligent. A straightforward tactical problem. Kale, using the tactics I had taught him, set up a series of traps and ambushes. His militia, with their superior weapons and discipline, decimated the Grokan warriors in a single, decisive battle. The cost was 3 wounded militia members, but no deaths. The reward was control of the entire Ironwood Grove. We now had a steady supply of wood that was as hard as steel. Alara could now craft powerful bows and shields. One by one, we began to pacify the forest. Each resource node we captured made us stronger, allowing us to take the next one more easily. It was a classic snowball effect. My territory was expanding. The villagers were no longer just farmers. They were loggers, miners, soldiers, and artisans. I had transformed their entire society. I was not just a leader, I was a nation builder. But as our influence grew, so did the danger. The Baron would not remain ignorant forever, and the hidden power behind him was still a mystery. Lyra's mission was more critical than ever. A week after she left, the pendant in my pocket grew cold. Not just cool, but ice cold. It was a feeling of pure dread. It was not the signal I had designed. I had told her to break it. This was something else. A warning. Lyra was not just in danger. She had found the source of the enemy's power. The cold pendant was a critical data point. Lyra was alive, but compromised. The signal was a deliberate, controlled activation of the pendant's latent energy, not a desperate cry for help. It was a warning, a piece of intelligence. My mind raced through the possibilities. The probability that she was captured and forced to send the signal was high, around 60%. The probability that she had discovered something so dangerous she needed to warn me without breaking cover was 40%. I chose to trust my agent's competence. Lyra was a survivor. This was not a cry for extraction. It was a sign to accelerate my own plans. The timetable for a direct confrontation with the Baron had just been moved up. Our current position was strong but static. The village was secure, and our resource acquisition in the forest was successful. But we were an island. To fight a war, I needed to project power beyond my immediate territory. The first step was to move my core operations out of the village. The mine, the main forge, and my command center were all under the same roof. It was efficient, but it was also a single point of failure. One good spy and my entire empire would crumble. I needed a dedicated base, a hidden fortress that could serve as my true seat of power. I used the Eye of the Abyss combined with the geological data from our mining to search for the perfect location. The system highlighted a spot 3 miles south of the village, a cluster of granite hills with a deep, natural cave system. It was defensible, isolated, and most importantly, it had its own water source and was geologically stable. I presented the plan to my lieutenants. We would construct a new secret base called the Shadow Bastion. The village would remain our public face, our economic hub. The Bastion would be our military and industrial heart. The project was massive. It would require hundreds of man-hours and a significant portion of our resources. Boren's miners were tasked with expanding the caves. Alara was to design a new, more efficient forge complex. The cost analysis was daunting. Initial setup required 500 units of shadow ore for reinforcing the cave structure and building the forge. It also required 200 units of ironwood for support beams and defensive structures. This was a huge capital investment, nearly a sixth of our total ore reserves. It would delay our militia's equipment upgrades by at least a month. It was a strategic gamble. Short-term weakness for long-term security. I made the decision. We would proceed. I trusted my analysis. A decentralized network is always more resilient than a centralized one. This was a fundamental principle of both warfare and server architecture. While the construction of the Bastion began, I turned my attention to our military. Kale's 15-man militia was effective, but too small. I needed to expand our forces without raising suspicion from the Baron. The solution was to create a tiered system. The Core 15 would become my elite unit, the Shadow Guard. They would receive the best training and equipment. They would be permanently stationed at the Bastion. For the village defense, I established a town watch, a rotating force of 30 men, armed with simpler, non-magical weapons. Their official duty was to guard against bandits and beasts. Their real purpose was to be a reserve force. This structure allowed me to triple my military strength without a significant increase in our visible footprint. The cost was in training time and the production of basic equipment, roughly another 300 units of ore and iron. The next step was logistics. We needed a secure and hidden route between the village and the new Bastion. I tasked Kale and his best scouts with carving a path through the densest part of the forest, using natural cover to hide it. They created a masterpiece of stealth engineering. The path was almost invisible, even from a few feet away. They used streams, rock formations, and ancient trees to mask the trail. It was a supply line the Baron would never find. With the Bastion under construction and the army being restructured, I focused on our economy. The shadow pottery was a brilliant product, but we had no way to sell it in large quantities. The village elder's cart was not enough. I needed a real merchant, someone who could navigate the complex world of trade and politics. I couldn't recruit one from the village. I needed to find an outsider, a professional. This meant sending someone to the city. The mission was too important for a simple villager. It required guile, charisma, and a deep understanding of economics. I had only one person with the baseline intellect for the job, myself. But I couldn't leave, so I chose the next best thing. I would train a proxy. I selected a young man named Finn. He was clever, a quick learner, and most importantly, he was ambitious. The Eye of the Abyss showed his hidden trait was silver tongue. For a month, I gave Finn a crash course in economics, negotiation, and political science. I poured all my knowledge from my past life into him. I was forging a master merchant, my own personal finance minister. I gave him a starting capital of 50 silver coins and a cart full of our finest shadow pottery. His mission was to go to the capital, establish a trade agreement with a major merchant guild, and create a front company for our operations. The risk was immense. If he failed, he could expose us all. But the potential reward was a steady stream of income and a legitimate business that could act as a cover for our intelligence and military activities. Finn left for the capital, a young man on whose shoulders rested the economic future of our nation. With him gone, I felt the pressure mounting. I had multiple critical projects running in parallel. The Bastion, the army, the new trade route. Any one of them could fail and bring the whole system down. I was juggling too many balls. My own management capacity was the new bottleneck. I needed a better way to process information and issue commands. I turned to Cage, my void fox. The Eye of the Abyss was a powerful intelligence tool, but it was passive. I needed it to be active. I began to experiment, pushing my connection with Cage to its limits. I found that I could project my consciousness through Keiji, using his senses as my own. I could see through his eyes, hear through his ears, even from miles away. It was a high drain ability, but it was a game changer. I could now personally oversee the Bastion's construction while sitting in the village. I could monitor Kale's patrols while analyzing Alara's new schematics. I had become a real-time strategy commander. This new ability allowed me to micromanage my growing empire with incredible efficiency. I could spot problems and issue new orders instantly. My productivity increased by 200%. The construction of the Shadow Bastion accelerated. Boren's miners, guided by my direct oversight through Cage, avoided a major cave-in and discovered a new, smaller vein of shadow ore within the granite hill. This discovery was a massive windfall. It added another 1,000 units to our reserves, more than paying for the entire construction cost of the Bastion. My gamble had paid off spectacularly. Ilara, with my remote guidance, perfected the design for the new forge. It used a geothermal vent we had discovered deep in the caves to power the bellows. It was a self-sustaining industrial complex. Kale's training of the Shadow Guard also benefited. I could watch their sparring sessions through Kaga's eyes and provide real-time tactical feedback. Their combat effectiveness was growing at an exponential rate. The village was flourishing. The wall was complete. The pottery trade, even on a small scale, was bringing in a steady income. We were no longer a starving village. We were a prosperous and well-defended town. The change was not just physical, it was social. The villagers walked with a new confidence. They were no longer afraid. They were proud. They were the people of the Miracle Boy. My social engineering had created a new national identity, but our success did not go unnoticed. Kale's patrols reported an increase in the Baron's activity on our borders. More patrols, more frequent, and better armed. He was probing our defenses. He was like a player noticing an anomaly on his minimap. He wasn't sure what it was, but he knew something was different. He was beginning to suspect that our village was more than just a lucky group of hunters. Then, I received a new piece of intelligence that confirmed my fears. A traveling merchant passing through our village spoke of a new tax the Baron was levying, a tax on any new construction. Specifically, on walls. This was not a random tax. This was a targeted move. He knew about our wall. His intelligence network was better than I had anticipated. He was trying to force my hand, to make me reveal my true strength. I had two choices: pay the tax, which would be a huge drain on our resources and an admission of guilt, or refuse, which would be an open declaration of war. It was a classic strategic dilemma. I chose a third option: deception. I would pay the tax, but not with money. I would pay with our new product, the Shadow Pottery. It was a move designed to achieve multiple objectives. First, it would placate the Baron and buy me more time. Second, it would introduce our high-value product directly to his court, creating demand and making him economically dependent on us. Third, and most importantly, it would allow me to get my own assets inside his castle. Each pot would be a potential Trojan horse, a container for messages, or perhaps something more. The Baron's tax collector arrived, flanked by 10 heavily armed guards. He was a different man than the last one. This one was not greedy. He was a professional soldier, cold and observant. I met him at the new gatehouse. I was no longer a 10-year-old boy. I was the official representative of the village, a position the elder had gladly ceded to me. The power dynamic had shifted. He demanded the tax in gold. I told him we had no gold. I offered him our pottery instead, explaining its unique preservative properties. I presented it as a humble offering from a loyal village. He was skeptical, but my eye of the abyss told me he was also intrigued. The ability to preserve food was a powerful strategic advantage for any army. He agreed to take a sample back to the Baron. This was a partial victory. I had avoided an immediate conflict. But I had also revealed one of my aces. The Baron would now know about my unique technology. The information war had escalated. A week later, a message returned from the Baron. He was impressed. He would accept the tax in the form of 100 shadow pots per month. It was a steep price, but one we could afford. He also sent a summons. He wanted the creator of this pottery to come to his castle to discuss a larger trade agreement. He wanted to meet the Miracle Boy. The trap was being set. I couldn't go, of course. Walking into his castle would be suicide, but I couldn't refuse either. That would be an act of defiance. I needed a proxy, a representative who could go in my place. Ilara was the logical choice. He was the actual craftsman, but he was too important to risk. If the Baron captured him, he would gain the secret to producing shadow pottery. I could not allow that. I decided to send the village elder. He was respected, non-threatening, and most importantly, he was completely loyal to me. I would feed him his lines, and he would be my puppet. I spent 2 days coaching him, preparing him for every possible question, every possible trick. I gave him a carefully crafted story about how he discovered the secret glaze in an ancient ruin. The elder left for the Baron's castle, carrying our first tax payment of 100 pots. Hidden in the glaze of one of those pots was a microscopic rune, a tracking marker that only my eye of the abyss could see. I could now track the pot's location within the castle. It was a primitive GPS, but it was a vital piece of intelligence. I could finally begin to map the interior of the Baron's fortress. The days while the Elder was gone were tense. Our entire strategy hinged on this diplomatic mission. If he succeeded, we would have a direct line into the Baron's court. If he failed, we would have a war. While we waited, Finn returned from the capital. He was a changed man. He was no longer a naive village boy. He was a confident, well-dressed merchant, and he was successful. He had not just established a trade route, he had created a shell corporation, the Blackwood Trading Company, and secured an exclusive contract with the largest merchant guild in the kingdom. He had turned my initial investment of 50 silver into a profit of 500 gold. It was a staggering return. Our economic problems were solved. We now had the funding for a prolonged war. Finn's face slap moment was for me. He had exceeded my wildest expectations. My training had unlocked his potential, and he had become a powerful asset. He was my new Chancellor of the Exchequer. He also brought news from the capital. The kingdom was not a stable place. There were rumors of war on the northern border, of cults gaining power in the shadows. The world was much bigger and more dangerous than I had imagined. The Baron was a minor player in a much larger game. This was both good and bad news. Good, because the king was too distracted to pay attention to our small corner of the world. Bad, because there were far more powerful enemies than the Baron. Finn's report solidified my strategy. I had to consolidate my power in this region quickly. I had to turn the Baron's lands into my own impregnable fortress before the larger powers took notice of me. The Elder returned from his mission. He was shaken, but alive. He had been successful. The Baron had bought the story. He had signed a trade agreement for a steady supply of our pottery. The Elder had also managed to get our tracking pot placed in the Baron's private study. I now had eyes, or at least a marker, in the heart of the enemy's command center. The intelligence game was on. But the Elder brought back something else. A warning. He had seen strange men in dark robes advising the Baron. Men who did not look like soldiers or nobles. Their faces were hidden, but their aura of power was unmistakable. I used the Eye of the Abyss to analyze the Elder's memory of them. The energy signature was faint, but it was there. It was the same cold, disciplined magic I had sensed from the goblins in the pacifier. These were the puppet masters. The cultists Finn had heard rumors about. They were not just advising the Baron, they were controlling him. My real enemy had a face, even if it was hidden behind a dark hood. Then the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The pendant in my pocket grew cold again, the same signal Lyra had sent. But this time I knew what it meant. I focused my senses, using Kaig as a relay. I connected to the pendant. It was not a warning. It was a location. She was not in danger. She was giving me a target. The signal was coming from inside the Baron's castle, from the same room as my tracking pot. Lyra had infiltrated the Baron's study, and she had found the cultists. She was standing in the same room as the puppet masters. My heart hammered in my chest. My agent was in the belly of the beast. The information she could provide would be invaluable, but the risk was unimaginable. I had to trust her training, her skills. The construction of the Shadow Bastion was now 70% complete. The forge was operational. The Shadow Guard was fully equipped. Our economy was stable. We were ready for the next phase. I stood on the completed wall of my village, looking out at the territory I now controlled. The Ironwood Grove, the Spider Caves, the Glowmoss Cavern, they were all part of my domain. I had transformed a dying village into a fortified, self-sufficient town-state. I had built an army, an economy, and an intelligence network from scratch. I was no longer just surviving. I was thriving. But the cold pendant in my pocket was a constant reminder. The game had changed. The tutorial was over. The first real boss battle was about to begin, and my best agent was standing right in front of him. Lyra's signal confirmed the Shadow Bastion's necessity. The village was my economy, but the Bastion had to become my unbreakable core. The construction timeline was no longer a strategic goal, it was an absolute deadline. I transferred my primary command post to the unfinished Bastion. The place was a chaotic construction site, filled with the sounds of hammers and the shouts of Boren's miners, but it was secure. My first order of business was to establish a fully functional command center. A dedicated cave, reinforced with ironwood and shadow ore, equipped with maps, resource ledgers, and a direct line of communication to my lieutenants. This cost 50 units of ore and 20 of ironwood, a significant expense for a non-production facility. But information management is the bedrock of any successful operation. The investment was non-negotiable. With the command center established, I focused on turning the Bastion into a living, breathing mechanism. I designed a system of production chains that would make us almost entirely self-sufficient. The first chain was food production. The cave had a natural spring, providing fresh water. I tasked a team with creating a subterranean farm, using the glowing moss we had secured as a light source. The project was ambitious. It required creating a complex irrigation system and finding crops that could thrive with the moss's unique light spectrum. The Eye of the Abyss was crucial for this research. I identified 3 types of fungi and a species of cave root that were not only edible but also nutrient-rich. We had our staple crops. The estimated food output would support a population of 200 people. The second chain was industrial production. Alara's new geothermal forge was the centerpiece. It was 20% more efficient than the village forge and could handle much higher temperatures. This allowed Alara to begin work on a new alloy. I called it shadow steel. It was a fusion of ironwood ash, shadow ore, and high-grade iron. The result was a metal that was light, incredibly durable, and had high magical conductivity. The production cost of shadow steel was high. 1 ingot required 10 units of iron, 5 of ore, and 1 of ironwood. But its properties were worth the price. It was a Tier 3 material in a Tier 1 world. This new material allowed us to upgrade our entire military. Kale's Shadow Guard was the first to receive new armor and weapons forged from shadow steel. Their combat effectiveness rating jumped by a calculated 50%. The third and most critical chain was defense. The Bastion's natural defensibility was high, but I reinforced it. I designed a series of choke points, murder holes, and hidden passages within the cave system. I invested 100 units of shadow ore into creating a set of retractable spike traps at the main entrance. They could be activated from the command center, turning the Bastion's only entrance into a death trap. The Bastion was no longer just a cave. It was a machine, a fortress designed for a long siege. Its purpose was to allow a small number of defenders to hold out against a much larger force indefinitely. While the Bastion grew, I had to manage the human element. The workforce was composed of the most loyal and skilled villagers, but they were still people. They had fears, conflicts, and needs. I appointed Boren as the Bastion's official warden. He was no longer just a miner. He was the governor of our secret city. His job was to manage the day-to-day life of the inhabitants, resolving disputes and maintaining morale. This created a new internal conflict. Kale, as head of the military, saw himself as the second in command. He viewed Boren, a former farmer, as his subordinate. The tension between security and civilian authority was immediate. I had to intervene. I called them both to the new command center. I laid out the organizational chart. Boren was in charge of the Bastion's internal affairs. Kale was in charge of its external defense. They were equals, each with their own domain. It was a delicate balance, but it was necessary. A clear chain of command prevents confusion in a crisis. This was another lesson from my 14 years in Eternal Abyss. Guild drama can destroy even the most powerful players. To further solidify the new social structure, I introduced new roles. I selected a woman named Anna, the village's former healer, to become the Bastion's chief medic. She was put in charge of the infirmary and the new hydroponic farms. Her practical knowledge of herbs, combined with my eye's ability to identify new medicinal plants, made her incredibly effective. We were able to synthesize our own healing salves and potions, reducing our reliance on outside trade. I also recruited a young, sharp-witted boy named Bram to act as my personal aide and runner. His job was to carry messages between the Bastion and the village, a high-stakes job that required speed and discretion. My core team was expanding. I now had a warden, a general, a quartermaster, a chief medic, and an intelligence network. I was no longer just a leader. I was the head of a functioning government. The system was working, but it was hungry. The Bastion consumed resources at an alarming rate. The farms, the forge, the defenses, they all required a constant influx of raw materials and energy. Our income from the pottery trade, while significant, was not enough. I needed a new revenue stream. I turned to Finn, my man in the capital. I sent him a message via a trusted merchant. The message was a set of schematics, drawn by me and refined by Alara. It was for a new type of plow, reinforced with a small amount of shadow steel at the tip. It was 3 times more durable and 20% more efficient than any existing plow. This was my next economic face slap. We would not sell the plows. We would license the design to the Merchant Guild through Finn's front company. We would sell the idea, not the product. The profits would be enormous. While my economic plans were in motion, Lyra sent another signal. This one was different. It was a series of short, cold pulses. A code. I had taught her a simple binary system before she left. I deciphered the message. It was one word. Warehouse. It was a location. She had found something important, something stored away from the castle. It was a new lead. I cross-referenced the signal's general direction with the maps Finn had sent me from the capital. The Baron owned a series of warehouses in the city's merchant district under the name of a shell company. This was a critical piece of intelligence. The cultists were not just operating out of the castle. They had a logistical footprint in the city. They were more organized than I thought. I sent a message back to Lyra using a secret channel Finn had established. A simple coded advertisement in the city's newspaper. The message was 2 words: observe only. It was too soon to act. I needed more data. The construction of the Bastion was now 90% complete. It was a marvel of guerrilla engineering. A hidden city that could house and support my entire core population for years if needed. It was time to test it. Not against an enemy, but against nature. The Eye of the Abyss had detected a pattern in the local weather. A massive storm was coming. A once-a-decade event that would flood the entire region. This was a perfect stress test for our new home. It would test our water seals, our food stores, and our people's ability to live in a confined space for an extended period. I gave the order. The entire core population of the village, roughly 150 men, women, and children, were to evacuate to the Shadow Bastion. We told the rest of the village it was a sacred ritual to pray for protection from the storm. The evacuation was a massive logistical challenge. We had to move a month's worth of food, water, and medical supplies through the hidden path without being seen. It took 3 nights of frantic, silent work. The last of our people entered the Bastion just as the first drops of rain began to fall. Boren gave the order and a massive ironwood-reinforced stone door rolled into place, sealing the entrance. We were cut off from the world. The storm was a monster. We could hear the wind howling outside, the sound of trees snapping. The rain was a constant, deafening roar. But inside the Bastion, we were safe and dry. The test revealed several weaknesses in our design. A minor leak in the western tunnel. An issue with air circulation in the lower levels. I recorded every issue, every data point. This was invaluable information for future upgrades. The social test was even more important. 150 people trapped in a cave. It was a recipe for conflict. But my command structure held. Boren managed the living quarters, Anna the infirmary, and Kale the internal patrols. There were arguments, of course, fights over rations, disputes over personal space. But Boren, with the authority I had given him, handled them all. He was proving to be an excellent choice for Warden. After 5 days, the storm broke. We opened the great door to a changed world. The forest was battered. The river had overflowed its banks. The village had suffered some flooding, but our new wall had held. The Bastion had passed its first test. It was a viable, long-term shelter. My people now saw it not as a dark cave, but as their ark, the thing that had saved them from the flood. Their faith in me was now absolute, but the storm had brought a new, unexpected problem. The flooding had washed away a section of the riverbank, exposing something that had been buried for centuries. A ruin, an ancient stone structure covered in faded runes. My Eye of the Abyss went into overdrive. The energy signature coming from the ruin was immense. It was old, powerful, and it felt nothing like the Baron's magic. This was something else entirely. I led a small team to investigate. Kale and 5 of his best shadow guard. The ruin was a single large chamber, half filled with mud and water. In the center was a stone altar, and on the altar was a book. The book was bound in some strange reptilian leather and was locked with a complex mechanism. The runes on its cover glowed with a faint blue light. My Eye of the Abyss could not read them. They were a language older than anything I had ever encountered, but it could read the energy. This was a grimoire, a book of magic, and the energy it was emitting was one of pure, unadulterated knowledge. This was not a weapon. It was a library. I tried to open the lock, but it was impossible. It was a puzzle, not a keyhole. It required a specific sequence of actions, a specific understanding of its ancient magic. It was a high-level artifact, but I had a tool that could solve any puzzle. I focused my will, pouring all my mental energy into the Eye of the Abyss. I didn't try to read the runes. I tried to read the lock's intent, its purpose, its history. The lock showed me a vision, a series of images, a star falling from the sky, a civilization of strange, non-human beings, and a ritual that required a specific component, the blood of a summoner. This was the key. The grimoire was sealed and it could only be opened by someone with my specific class. This ruin was not an accident. It was a message, a legacy left for someone like me. The dilemma was stark. Opening the book could grant me immense power, knowledge that could help me defeat the Baron and the cult, but it could also be a trap. Ancient magic is never safe. I weighed the risks. The probability of a magical trap was high, maybe 50%. The probability of the knowledge being too dangerous or corrupting was even higher, but the probability of defeating the cult without a significant power-up was near zero. I made my choice. I took a dagger from Kale, sliced open my palm, and let my blood drip onto the lock. The runes flared with a brilliant blue light. The lock mechanism clicked open. The book fell open to a random page. The text was still unreadable, but the illustrations were clear. They showed diagrams of creatures, of summoning circles, of celestial alignments. This was a bestiary, a guide to summoning creatures beyond my wildest imagination. And then I saw it. On a page detailing creatures of the void, there was a drawing. A creature of living shadow with 9 flowing tails and eyes that held the emptiness of space. It was Cage, my void fox. The book had a name for him. It called him a harbinger, a scout for a much larger, more powerful entity that lived in the space between worlds. Cage was not just a familiar. He was the first sign of an invasion. This new information was a tactical nuke. My greatest asset, my loyal companion, was potentially a harbinger of an world-ending threat. The scale of the game had just expanded from a local conflict to a cosmic horror story. I closed the book. The information was too dangerous. I couldn't share it with anyone, not even my lieutenants. It would cause a panic. I had to carry this burden alone. I ordered Kyle and his men to secure the ruin. We would build a small, fortified outpost around it. This grimoire was now my most valuable and most dangerous asset. It had to be protected at all costs. As we returned to the Bastion, a runner met us on the hidden path. It was Bram. He was out of breath, his face pale with fear. He had a message from the village. It was not from the Baron. It was not from a scout. It was a simple, terrifying piece of news. A plague had broken out in the village. A strange, fast-acting illness that was resistant to all of Anna's remedies. I rushed to the village. The scene was grim. A dozen people were already sick, their skin covered in dark, pulsating veins. The local healer was at a loss. My Eye of the Abyss analyzed one of the victims. The system gave me a clear diagnosis. This was not a natural disease. It was a magical curse. A blood magic curse, to be precise. The energy signature was faint, but unmistakable. It was the signature of the cult. This was their response to my growing power. They couldn't find my base, so they attacked my people. It was a brutal, cowardly, and incredibly effective move. My entire economic base was now under threat. I had to find a cure, and fast. I took a sample of the victim's blood back to my new lab in the Bastion. I worked with Anna, using the Eye of the Abyss to analyze the curse's magical structure. It was complex, a web of interconnected runes woven into the victim's life force. But like any code, it had a weakness, a central rune that acted as the anchor for the entire curse. If I could break that rune, I could break the curse. But breaking it required a specific magical frequency, a specific counterspell. I had no idea how to create one. I was a summoner, not a mage. My knowledge of magic was purely theoretical. Then I remembered the grimoire. It was a long shot, but it was the only one I had. I returned to the ruin, the book held in my hands. I didn't need to read the words. I needed to find a concept. I focused on the idea of a counterspell, of a cleansing ritual. I let my intuition guide me, my fingers flipping through the ancient pages, and I found it, a diagram, not a spell, but a creature. It was a small, glowing creature that looked like a hummingbird made of pure light. The book called it a null sprite. Its description was simple. It consumes raw magic. It was the perfect tool for the job, but summoning it was not easy. It required a specific ritual, a specific set of materials, and a specific emotional state. The state required was not fear or resolve. It was pure, unadulterated hope. How could I feel hope in a situation like this? My people were dying. My plans were on the verge of collapse. It seemed impossible. But then I looked at Anna, working tirelessly to comfort the sick, her own face etched with worry but not despair. I saw the villagers, the healthy ones, bringing food and water to the sick, risking their own lives. They had not given up. They still believed in me. They still had hope. And their hope became my hope. I gathered the materials, a vial of pure spring water, a leaf from the ironwood tree, and a feather from a wild bird. I drew the summoning circle, just as the grimoire depicted. I focused on the feeling of hope, the collective hope of my people. I poured that feeling into the circle. The runes glowed with a soft, golden light. A tiny, beautiful creature of pure light materialized in the center of the circle. A null sprite. It was a tiny, fragile thing, but my Eye of the Abyss showed me its true power. Its magic consumption stat was off the charts. It was a living anti-magic field. I had my cure. I took the sprite back to the village. I let it fly over the sick. It hovered over each person, and the dark veins on their skin receded, the curse magic drawn out and consumed by the tiny creature. Within an hour, everyone was cured. The plague was gone. The face slap was not for the Baron, but for the cult. I had taken their best shot, their magical superweapon, and I had neutralized it. The villagers erupted in cheers. I was not just their leader. I was their savior, their miracle worker. My reputation had ascended to a legendary status. My power base was now unshakable. The null sprite, its job done, dissolved into motes of light. It was a temporary summon, but I now had the knowledge to call it again. I had a weapon against the cult's greatest strength. But the victory was costly. The research, the summon, it had drained me. My own energy reserves were dangerously low, and the attack had revealed a critical vulnerability. I could not protect my people from magical attacks on this scale. I needed to upgrade my defenses. Not just physical walls, but magical ones. I needed to create a ward, a shield that could protect the entire village from curses and other forms of hostile magic. The grimoire held the answer. It described a ritual for creating a permanent ward, but it required a massive power source. A constant, steady stream of magical energy. The shadow ore was the obvious choice. It could store energy. I had thousands of units of it. The plan was simple. I would create a network of large, refined shadow ore crystals and bury them at key points around the village. These crystals would act as batteries, powering the ward. Alara was tasked with refining the crystals. It was a delicate process, requiring the new geothermal forge. The cost would be 1,000 units of our best ore, a third of our entire stockpile. It was another huge gamble. I was spending a fortune on a purely defensive system, but the alternative was to leave my people vulnerable to another magical attack. The choice was clear. While Alara worked, I received another coded message from Lyra. It was a single word, shipment, and a date. 3 days from now. Something was being moved from the Baron's warehouse. This was the opportunity I had been waiting for. A chance to see what the cult was up to intercept their logistics. I sent a message to Kale and his shadow guard. Prepare for a raid. The target was not the shipment itself. It was the information. I wanted to know what they were shipping, where it was going, and who was moving it. It was a high-risk intelligence gathering mission. The plan was for Kale and his 10 best men to set up an ambush on the road from the city. Lyra would mark the target vehicle. They were to disable the transport, neutralize the guards, and capture the cargo manifest. No survivors. This was our first offensive move against the cult. It was a declaration of war. The small-scale conflict over a village was about to escalate into a full-blown shadow war. The day of the raid arrived. I watched through Cage's eyes, my consciousness projected miles away, hovering in the trees above the road. I was the eye in the sky, the mission commander. I saw the convoy approaching. A single, heavily armored wagon flanked by 12 mounted soldiers, but they were not the Baron's men. They were wearing the dark robes of the cult. Lyra's signal came, a flash of a small mirror from a nearby rooftop. This was the target. Kale gave the signal. The ambush was sprung. A volley of ironwood arrows, tipped with shadow steel, rained down on the convoy. The effect was devastating. The arrows punched through the cultist's armor as if it were paper. 8 of the 12 guards went down in the first volley. The shadow guard's new equipment was brutally effective. The remaining 4 cultists were skilled, drawing swords that glowed with a dark energy. But they were outnumbered. Kale and his men swarmed them, a flurry of black steel and silent death. The fight was over in seconds. The shadow guard were not soldiers. They were predators. They moved with a speed and efficiency that was terrifying to behold. My training and Alara's equipment had turned them into an elite special forces unit. Kale secured the wagon. The cargo was not what I expected. It was not gold or weapons. It was a dozen large, sealed crates. My eye of the abyss could not penetrate them. They were lined with a lead-like material. But Kale found the manifest. It was a single scroll, written in a strange, runic script. I couldn't read it, but I recognized the script. It was the same as the one in the grimoire. I had the key to deciphering it. I ordered Kale to bring the manifest and one of the crates back to the Bastion. They were to burn the rest of the wagon and make it look like a bandit attack. The raid was a flawless success. We had acquired critical intelligence and a piece of their cargo, all without revealing our hand. The cost was minimal. 2 guards with minor injuries. Back in the Bastion, I used the grimoire to translate the manifest. The text was horrifying. The crates did not contain objects. They contained people. Children, to be precise. The manifest listed their names, their ages, and a strange notation. Potential. Latent. They were being shipped to a location in the north, a place called the Obsidian Citadel, a place marked on Finn's map as a known cultist stronghold. This was their business. They were not just controlling monsters. They were kidnapping children with magical potential. They were harvesting them. The true nature of my enemy was revealed. They were not just villains. They were monsters. I opened the crate we had recovered. Inside was a young girl, no older than 8. She was unconscious, floating in a strange blue liquid. My Eye of the Abyss confirmed the manifest's data. She had a massive, untapped magical potential. I now had a survivor, a witness, and a new, terrible responsibility. I had to save these children. My personal war for vengeance against the Baron had just become a crusade against a far greater evil. My resolve hardened. The Baron was a pawn. The cult was the real enemy, and their headquarters, the Obsidian Citadel, was my new ultimate objective. But I was not ready. Not yet. First, I had to fortify my own position. Alara had finished the warding crystals. They were magnificent, each one a flawless 3-foot-tall shard of polished shadow ore, humming with contained energy. We spent the next 2 nights planting them around the village, following the ritual described in the grimoire. I personally oversaw the process, using the Eye of the Abyss to ensure each crystal was perfectly aligned. The final step was the activation. It required me to channel a massive amount of my own energy into the network, acting as the spark to ignite the system. The risk of personal injury was high. I stood in the center of the village, my hands on the central warding stone. I drew upon my life force, my connection to Kag, and poured it all into the crystal network. The world went white. When my vision returned, the village was changed. A faint, almost invisible dome of golden light now covered the entire town. It was beautiful, and it was deadly. The Bastion was my fortress, but now the village was my sanctuary. The magical ward was active. My system analysis showed its defensive rating against magical attacks was over 9,000. It could withstand a direct assault from a powerful archmage. The cost of 1,000 ore units had been steep, but the result was priceless. My people were finally safe. The successful raid and the activation of the village ward marked a turning point. We were no longer on the defensive. We had assets, a secure base, and a clear picture of our enemy. But this success came at a price. Anonymity. The attack on a cult shipment, no matter how well disguised, would not go unanswered. I calculated a 75% probability that the cult would escalate its efforts to find us. The pressure from the outside world was about to increase exponentially. My first priority was to deal with the rescued child. Anna had stabilized her, but she remained in a magical coma. My Eye of the Abyss revealed the cult had placed a tracking rune on her, a faint but persistent magical signature. This was a critical vulnerability. The rune was acting as a beacon, leading the cult directly to us. I had to remove it, but the magic was delicate, tied directly to her life force. A clumsy attempt could kill her. I consulted the grimoire. It had a section on counter runes and magical cleansing. The ritual was complex, requiring a combination of rare ingredients and precise magical channeling. The cost was 50 units of refined shadow ore and a significant drain on my own energy. I performed the ritual myself in the Bastion's medical bay. It took 6 hours of intense concentration. I had to weave a counter rune that would slowly starve the tracking rune of its power without harming the child. The operation was a success. The tracking rune dissolved into inert dust. The girl was safe, and our location was once again secure. But the effort left me exhausted. My personal mana pool was now a critical resource I had to manage carefully. The child, whose name we learned was Alara after our blacksmith, became a symbol for our cause. She was a living reminder of the cult's evil. Her presence solidified the resolve of my people. Our war was now a holy war. With the immediate magical threat neutralized, I turned my attention to the Baron. He was the cult's local agent, and it was time to remove him from the board. But a direct assault on his castle was still too risky. I decided to employ economic warfare. Finn's new trade company, the Blackwood Trading Company, was now a legitimate and powerful entity in the capital. It was time to use it as a weapon. My plan was simple but ruthless. We would use our superior technology, the Shadow Steel Plow, to crash the agricultural market. We would flood the kingdom with cheap, high-quality food, driving down prices and bankrupting the traditional landowners. The Baron's power was based on his land and the grain he produced. By destroying the value of his primary asset, I would destroy his power base. It was an attack on his treasury, not his walls. Finn executed the plan perfectly. He licensed the plow's design to a dozen different manufacturers, creating a massive production boom. The market was flooded with cheap grain within 2 months. The economic impact was immediate and devastating. The price of grain plummeted by 40%. Landowners across the kingdom were facing ruin, and the Baron, who was already over-leveraged, was hit the hardest. His income from taxes and grain sales dried up. He could no longer afford to pay his soldiers or maintain his castle. His power was collapsing from within, just as I had planned. This economic attack also served a secondary purpose. It created chaos. The widespread financial ruin led to riots and unrest across the kingdom. The king and his armies were too busy dealing with the internal crisis to pay any attention to our remote region. I had effectively created my own smokescreen. Under the cover of a kingdom-wide economic depression, I could continue to build my forces without fear of royal intervention. It was a masterful strategic play. But the cult was a different matter. They did not care about economics. Their power was based on magic and fear. They would not be deterred by a market crash. They would see my hand in the chaos. Lyra sent a new message. The cultists in the Baron's castle were becoming more active. They were performing dark rituals, summoning creatures from the void. The Baron was no longer their puppet. He was their prisoner. They had fortified the castle, not with soldiers, but with magical wards and monstrous guardians. The castle was no longer a military fortress. It was a dark temple. This was a significant escalation. I needed more intelligence. I needed eyes inside that castle. Lyra was a master of stealth, but she couldn't get past the new magical defenses. I needed a new type of agent. I turned once again to the grimoire. It had a section on familiars, on creatures that could be summoned for espionage. I found the perfect candidate. A shadow imp. A small, intelligent creature that could become invisible and pass through solid walls. The summoning ritual was relatively simple, but it required a payment. The imp demanded a contract. It would serve me for 1 year in exchange for a single, powerful soul. It was a steep price. I refused to sacrifice any of my people. But the grimoire offered an alternative. I could create an artificial soul, a soul gem, using a large, flawless shadow ore crystal and a significant portion of my own life force. The cost was immense. It would permanently reduce my own life force by 10%. It was a permanent debuff. But the strategic advantage of having an agent who could walk through walls was too great to ignore. I created the soul gem. The process left me weak for a week, a chilling reminder of the price of power. I summoned the shadow imp and offered it the gem. It accepted the contract. I now had an invisible, intangible spy. I named it Whisper. I sent it to the Baron's castle with a single objective. Observe the cultists, learn their rituals, their numbers, and their leader. Whisper's reports were delivered telepathically. They were a stream of horrifying images and alien thoughts. The cult was more powerful than I had ever imagined. There were at least 20 mages in the castle, led by a high priest who wielded a terrifying power. They were not just controlling monsters, they were creating them. They were using the kidnapped children as raw material, their life force as fuel for their dark creations. The Baron's dungeons had been turned into a monstrous factory. The high priest was a true threat. Whisper's analysis showed his power level was at least 5 times my own. A direct confrontation would be suicide. I was completely outmatched in terms of raw power. This new intelligence forced me to change my entire strategy. I could not defeat the cult with force alone. I had to use my true weapon, my mind. I had to find a weakness, a flaw in their system. I focused on the rituals Whisper was observing. They were complex, powerful, but they all had one thing in common. They required a massive amount of ambient magical energy. The castle was built on a convergence of ley lines. This was their strength. They had a limitless power source. It was also their weakness. If I could disrupt that power source, I could disrupt their rituals. I could neuter their greatest weapon. The grimoire had a solution. A ritual of magical disruption. It would not destroy the ley lines, but it would create a temporary feedback loop, a storm of chaotic magic that would make any complex spellcasting impossible. The ritual was my equivalent of an EMP bomb. It would shut down all magic in a 1-mile radius for 24 hours. This would disable the castle's wards, banish their summoned guardians, and leave the cultists as nothing more than men in robes. But the ritual had a cost. It required a massive sacrifice of magical energy, more than I could provide. More than even my entire stockpile of shadow ore could provide. It required a living power source. There was only one creature in the region with that kind of power. The ancient, territorial beast that lived in the deepest part of the forest. The one my scouts had been avoiding for months. The one the grimoire called a Grove Titan. The Grove Titan was a neutral entity, a force of nature. It was not evil, but it was incredibly dangerous. Its power level was off the charts. Waking it, let alone trying to harness its power, was a suicidal idea, but it was my only option. I had to convince a godlike entity to lend me its power to fight a war it had no stake in. This was not a tactical problem. It was a diplomatic one. I spent a week studying the grimoire, learning everything I could about the Titan. It was not a creature of flesh and blood. It was a being of wood, stone, and pure life energy. It was the living soul of the forest. It did not speak in words. It communicated through thoughts, through feelings, through the rustling of leaves and the flow of water. To speak to it, I had to learn its language. I used Cog and my new projection ability to enter a deep meditative state. I reached out with my mind, not with words, but with intent. I showed the Titan the cult's corruption, the twisted creatures, the blighted land around the castle. I showed it the dying children, the life force being stolen and corrupted. I did not ask for its help. I simply showed it the truth. I presented my case to the highest court in this land. For 3 days, there was no response. The forest was silent. My own energy was draining away. I was on the verge of giving up. And then it answered. The answer was not a voice. It was a feeling. A deep, ancient sadness. A slow, rising anger. The forest itself was angry. The Titan had seen the corruption, and it had judged the cult guilty. It agreed to help. It would lend me its power, but only for a single, focused strike. I would have one chance to use its energy to fuel my disruption ritual. If I failed, it would not help me again. The plan was now set. I had my weapon. I had my target. I had my window of opportunity. The final phase of the operation was about to begin. It was time to remove the Baron and his cultist masters from the board. I gathered my forces, Kale and his 50 Shadow Guard, now fully equipped with Shadow Steel, Boren and 100 members of the Town Watch, who would act as a support force, Anna and her team of medics. This was the largest military operation we had ever attempted. The logistics were a nightmare. Moving 150 men through the forest without being detected required perfect planning and execution. We used the hidden paths we had built, moving only at night. It took 2 days to get our forces into position, surrounding the Baron's castle. We were an army of ghosts, waiting for the signal. The signal would be the disruption ritual. I would perform it at dawn, at the peak of the ley line's power. Kale and his forces would then have 24 hours to take the castle before the cult's magic returned. The pressure was immense. The fate of the entire region rested on this single operation. If we succeeded, we would be the new masters of this land. If we failed, we would be wiped out. As I prepared for the ritual, I received one final piece of intelligence. A message from Lyra. It was a single word. Trap. My blood ran cold. The cult knew we were coming. They had been feeding Lyra false information. The entire operation was a setup. The Baron's castle was a giant mousetrap, and we were about to walk right into it. I had seconds to make a decision. I could call off the attack, pull my forces back. But the cult would know we had discovered their trap. We would lose the element of surprise forever. Or I could proceed. I could walk into the trap, knowing it was a trap. I could use their own plan against them. It was an insane gamble. The odds of success were less than 10%. I looked at my people, their faces filled with trust and determination. They were ready to die for me. I could not lead them into a slaughter, but I could not retreat either. I chose a third option. I would change the plan. I would not attack the castle. I would attack their power source. I would use the Grove Titan's energy not just to disrupt the ley lines, but to overload them. It was a move of pure desperation. The grimoire had a warning about such a thing. Overloading a ley line convergence could have catastrophic, unpredictable consequences. It could create a permanent dead magic zone, or it could tear a hole in reality. But it would also cripple the cult's power base in this region permanently. It was a scorched earth policy. I would destroy the very thing they were fighting for. It was a move they would never anticipate. I sent a new set of orders to Kale. Do not attack the castle. Create a defensive perimeter. Prepare for a massive, uncontrolled magical release. I did not tell him what I was about to do. He would have tried to stop me. I stood on the hilltop overlooking the castle, the Grove Titan's power flowing into me. It was a torrent of pure life energy, more power than any mortal was ever meant to wield. I was a living conduit for a god. I began the ritual, not the disruption ritual, but a different one. A ritual of resonance. I focused all the Titan's energy into a single harmonic frequency designed to overload the ley lines beneath the castle. The ground began to shake. The sky above the castle turned black. The cultists inside would be feeling it now, the surge of raw, untamed magic. They would be in a panic, their own power turning against them. This was my face slapped to the high priest. He had laid a trap for me, but he had forgotten the first rule of warfare. Never underestimate your opponent. He had thought I was a pawn. I was about to prove I was a player. I poured the last of the Titan's energy into the ritual. A beam of pure green life energy shot from my hands, striking the ground. The earth erupted, the ley lines overloaded, the trap had been sprung, but the mouse had just killed the cat. The ley line overload was not an explosion. It was a silent, violent release of pure magical chaos. A dome of shimmering, unstable energy erupted from the castle, visible for miles. My risky gambit had worked, but the consequences were immediate. The Grove Titan's energy receded from me, the connection severed. The backlash from the ritual hit me like a physical blow, throwing me to the ground. My personal energy reserves were completely depleted, and my stats showed a temporary debuff. All attributes minus 50% for 24 hours. Kale's voice crackled in my mind through our telepathic link, a new skill I had developed. He reported that the castle's magical wards had shattered like glass. Strange, shadowy creatures that had been guarding the walls dissolved into nothingness. The cult's trap was broken, but so was all magic in the area. My Eye of the Abyss was flickering, struggling to function in the chaotic magical field. Their greatest weapon was gone, but so was one of my most powerful tools. This was the window. The 24 hours of magical silence. The cultists were now just men, trapped in a fortress with no magical defenses. But they were still dangerous, and the High Priest was still a threat. I issued my new orders to Kale. The objective had changed. We were no longer assaulting a fortified position. We were performing a surgical strike. The target was the High Priest. Capture or kill. All other cultists were secondary targets. This required a new plan of attack. A brute force assault was now viable, but inefficient. I decided on a two-pronged strategy. Kale and the Shadow Guard would perform a fast, direct assault on the main gate to draw out the bulk of the cult's forces. While they were engaged, Lyra, who had escaped the castle during the chaos, would lead a small strike team, including me, through a secret passage Whisper had discovered. We would go straight for the High Priest's chambers. This plan was risky. It placed me, in my weakened state, on the front lines. But I had to be there. Only my eye, even in its weakened state, could identify the High Priest and any magical artifacts he might still possess. The preparation for this new assault was frantic. We had a strict time limit. Every minute we wasted, the chaotic magic field was stabilizing. I calculated we had about 18 hours before low-level magic became possible again. We had to shift our entire resource allocation. Anna's medics prepared stabilization potions and bandages. Alara's forge worked overtime, producing single-use items, specifically flashbang grenades and smoke bombs using our alchemical knowledge. These non-magical tools would be our advantage in the coming fight. The cultists were mages. They were unused to fighting in a mundane physical environment. We would use their own weakness against them. I gathered the strike team. Myself, Lyra, and 5 of Kale's best Shadow Guard. Our equipment was specialized for stealth and close-quarters combat. Shadow steel daggers, short swords, and crossbows with armor-piercing bolts. The cost of this last-minute re-equipping was 200 units of shadow steel, a significant portion of our refined stockpile. But this was the final battle. There was no point in saving resources for a future we might not have. Before the assault began, I had to make a difficult decision. What to do with the rest of the village? They were safe behind our magical ward, but if we failed, the cult would eventually come for them. I implemented a scorched earth contingency plan. Boren and the town watch were given their orders. If we did not return in 24 hours, they were to collapse the entrance to the Shadow Bastion, sealing it forever. They were to evacuate the core population into the Bastion, along with all our knowledge, our resources, and our rescued children. They would survive, hidden from the world. It was a grim but necessary precaution. This decision weighed heavily on me. I was preparing for my own potential demise. Ensuring the survival of my people, it was the ultimate responsibility of a leader. To plan for failure as much as for success. With the contingency in place, the assault began. Kale and his 50 guards charged the main gate, their war cries echoing in the unnaturally silent air. The battle for the Baron's castle had begun. The cultists were caught completely by surprise. They were expecting a magical siege, not a mundane physical assault. Their response was slow and disorganized. They were mages without their magic. Kale's forces, clad in superior shadow steel armor, were a terrifying sight. They crashed through the makeshift barricades the cultists had erected, their enchanted weapons cutting through the cultists' robes with ease. This was the diversion. As the main battle raged at the front gate, my strike team, led by Lyra, slipped through the secret passage. It was a sewer tunnel, a foul, disgusting route, but it was unguarded. We moved through the castle's underbelly, the sounds of battle above us. Whisper, my imp familiar, scouted ahead, his intangible form a perfect reconnaissance tool. He confirmed our path was clear. We reached the High Priest's chambers, located in the highest tower of the castle. The door was made of solid ironwood, barred from the inside. There was no way to break it down silently. I used Whisper to phase through the door. He unbarred it from the inside. The advantage of a magical spy in a non-magical environment was absolute. We slipped inside, our weapons ready. The chamber was a laboratory of horrors. Cages lined the walls, some empty, some containing the twisted results of the cult's experiments. In the center of the room was the High Priest, surrounded by 3 of his elite guards. He was not panicking. He was calm, his face a mask of cold fury. He was a tall, imposing figure, and even without his magic, he radiated an aura of immense power. My Eye of the Abyss confirmed his physical stats were far superior to any normal human. The Baron was there too, huddled in a corner, a broken man. He was no longer a threat. He was just a victim, another one of the cult's disposable tools. My quest for vengeance on him seemed so small now. The High Priest looked at me, his eyes boring into mine. He knew who I was. He had been expecting me, but he had not been expecting me here, in his inner sanctum. Lyra's message had been a double trap. He had expected me to lead the main assault, to be caught in his trap at the front gate. My surgical strike had bypassed his entire plan. For the first time, I saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. The fight was immediate and brutal. My 5 Shadow Guard engaged his 3 elite guards. It was a battle of equals. Shadow steel against whatever dark metal the cult used. The sound of clashing blades filled the room. That left me and Lyra against the High Priest. My own combat ability was still hampered by the ritual's backlash. Lyra was fast, but she was an assassin, not a brawler. We were at a severe disadvantage. The High Priest moved with a speed that defied his size. He was a warrior, a master of a strange, fluid fighting style. He wielded a wicked-looking obsidian staff as if it were a spear. He lunged at me, his staff a black blur. I was too slow to react. But Cage, my Void Fox, materialized from my shadow, intercepting the blow. The staff passed through him as if he were smoke, but the force of the blow was still immense. The feedback threw me back, but it bought Lyra an opening. She darted in, her twin daggers a blur, aiming for the gaps in his robes. He swatted her away with the back of his hand, sending her crashing into a table of alchemical equipment. We were completely outmatched. His physical prowess was on par with Kale's, and his combat skill was far superior. I ran the numbers. Our probability of winning this fight was less than 5%. I needed to change the equation. I couldn't fight him physically. I had to fight him tactically. I used the Eye of the Abyss, pushing it to its limits, ignoring the pain in my head. I scanned him, looking for a weakness. His physical stats were high, his equipment was masterwork. But he had one vulnerability. An artifact, a large black amulet around his neck. It was the source of his enhanced physical abilities. It was a piece of cult technology. That was my target. I shouted to Lyra, the amulet. She understood immediately. Our objective was no longer to kill him, but to destroy his power source. It was a classic boss fight mechanic. The battle shifted. It was no longer a direct confrontation. It was a dance of distraction and precision strikes. I used Kaeg to harass him, to create openings. Lyra used her agility to dart in and out, her daggers chipping away at the amulet's chain. My Shadow Guard were also struggling. They had defeated 2 of the elite guards, but at the cost of one of their own. The final guard was a monster, a whirlwind of blades that was holding the 4 of them at bay. We were running out of time. The chaotic magic field was stabilizing. I could feel the first stirrings of ambient magic returning to the world. If the High Priest regained his magic, we were all dead. I had one last gamble, one final ace up my sleeve. The grimoire. I had brought it with me, strapped to my back. It was a risk, but I had anticipated a situation like this. I opened the book, not to a specific page, but to its core. I focused all my remaining will, not to summon a creature, but to unleash a pulse of raw, untamed knowledge. A psychic blast. The grimoire erupted with a wave of blue light. It was not an attack. It was a flood of pure information. Thousands of years of alien thoughts, of cosmic secrets, of impossible geometries. The High Priest screamed, clutching his head. His mind, as powerful as it was, could not handle the data flood. He was a mage, a scholar. I had weaponized the one thing he craved. Knowledge. His moment of weakness was all Lyra needed. She leaped, not at his throat, but at his chest. She grabbed the amulet with both hands and used her body weight to snap the chain. The amulet fell to the floor with a clatter. The High Priest's enhanced strength vanished. He was just a man now. A very strong, very skilled man, but a man nonetheless. He roared in fury, lashing out wildly. But his movements were slower now, more predictable. My shadow guard, having finally defeated the last of his elites, surrounded him. The fight was over. We had won. We had captured the High Priest and broken the back of the cult in this region. The cost was high. 2 of my best shadow guard were dead and the rest were wounded. I myself was on the verge of collapse. But the victory was absolute. Kale's forces had secured the rest of the castle. The remaining cultists had either been killed or had surrendered. The Baron was found weeping in his throne room, his mind broken. As the sun rose, a new flag was raised over the castle. Not the Baron's, not the King's. It was a simple black flag with the emblem of a 9-tailed fox. My flag. A new power had risen. The immediate aftermath was a whirlwind of activity. We had to secure the castle, tend to the wounded, and most importantly, deal with the prisoners and the horrors in the dungeons. We found 27 children in the dungeons, all in the same magical stasis as the first girl we rescued. Anna and her medics worked around the clock to stabilize them. They were all saved. The captured cultists were a problem. We couldn't just imprison them. They were too dangerous. I made a difficult decision. The elite guards and the mages were to be executed. The lower-level acolytes were given a choice: swear fealty to me or die. Most chose to live. They were fanatics, but they were also pragmatists. Their god had failed them. I was the new, tangible power in their world. I had just acquired 24 trained, albeit untrustworthy magic users. The High Priest was a different matter. He was too valuable to kill, too dangerous to imprison. He was a font of information about the cult, its structure, its goals. I had him placed in a specially designed cell in the deepest part of the Shadow Bastion, a cell with no magic whatsoever. With the castle secure and the prisoners dealt with, I turned my attention to the true prize. The cult's library. They had a vast collection of books, scrolls, and artifacts, a treasure trove of magical knowledge. I spent a week in that library, my eye of the abyss devouring information. I learned the cult's true name, the Order of the Black Sun. I learned their goal, to summon their dark god, a creature from the void, into our world. And I learned something else, something that chilled me to the bone. The Baron's territory was not their main base of operations. It was a minor, backwater outpost, a research facility. The Obsidian Citadel was their true headquarters, and what we had faced here was just a fraction of their power. We had not won the war. We had merely survived the first battle. But we had also grown stronger. We now had a castle, a vast territory, new resources, and new recruits. We had a library of enemy intelligence, and we had their leader. As I stood on the battlements of my new castle, looking out at the lands that were now mine, I felt a sense of grim satisfaction. The scrawny orphan boy was now a baron himself, a lord of a new rising power. The path ahead was dangerous. The Order of the Black Sun would not take this defeat lightly. They would send more forces, more powerful mages. The real war was just beginning. But I was ready. I had my army, my fortress, my economy, and my intelligence network. And I had the grimoire, a book of impossible power. The game was afoot, and I was no longer just a player. I was a king. The overload ritual was a desperate, all-or-nothing gambit, and the battlefield was the immediate consequence. The sky above the Baron's castle was a maelstrom of chaotic energy, a visible tear in the fabric of magic itself. My orders to Kale were precise. He was not to attack the castle directly. His forces, the 50 elite Shadow Guard and 100 Town Watch, were to form a hard perimeter 1 mile out. No one gets in, and more importantly, nothing gets out. This defensive posture confused my own men. They were primed for an assault, fueled by adrenaline and righteous anger. Now I was telling them to stand down and wait. It was a test of their discipline, a test of their faith in my command. My strike team, Lyra and the 5 guards, had a different objective. Our target was not the castle, but the leyline nexus itself, the epicenter of the magical devastation I had caused. I needed to analyze the aftermath and contain the fallout. The overload had done more than just disable magic. It had created a localized reality warp. The landscape around the castle was shifting, twisting. Trees grew and withered in seconds. Rocks floated in the air. It was a zone of pure chaos. This was an unforeseen consequence, a critical failure in my risk assessment. The grimoire had warned of unpredictable effects, but this was beyond anything I had imagined. The environmental cost of my victory was catastrophic. I had created a dead magic zone, but I had also created something far more dangerous. A wild magic zone. It was a region where the laws of physics were suggestions, not rules. It was a dungeon of my own making. My first priority was to stabilize the zone. I couldn't reverse the damage, but I might be able to contain it. The grimoire had theoretical sections on reality anchors, devices that could impose order on chaotic magic. Constructing one would be a monumental task. It required a perfect, flawless shadow ore crystal, larger than any we had ever refined. It would also require a constant power source to maintain, and the help of at least 10 trained mages. I had the ore, thanks to the Bastion's new vein. But I didn't have the mages. My 24 captured cultist acolytes were a potential resource, but they were untrained and untrustworthy. It was a manpower problem of the highest order. I had to start their training immediately. I couldn't teach them the cult's dark magic. I had to create a new magical doctrine from scratch, using the grimoire as a textbook and my own gamer's understanding of systems as a guide. I established a new institution within the Shadow Bastion, the Academy of the Void. Its first class would be the captured cultists. Their curriculum would be a fusion of elemental magic, runic theory, and absolute loyalty to me. This was a long-term project. The anchor would take months to build. In the meantime, the wild magic zone around the castle was a festering wound on the landscape, and something was beginning to crawl out of it. Kale's perimeter patrols reported the first sightings. Creatures that defied description. Twisted amalgams of flesh and magic born from the chaotic energy. They were like glitched mobs from a corrupted game file. These chaos beasts were unpredictable and highly aggressive. They attacked Kale's patrols on sight. Our shadow steel armor offered protection, but their attacks were not just physical. They corroded reality itself. We suffered our first casualties since the castle assault. 2 town watch members were erased from existence, their bodies dissolving into shimmering motes of light. The threat level of the new zone was far higher than I had calculated. We had to adapt our tactics. Standard military formations were useless. Kale developed a new doctrine of fluid, squad-based combat. Small, fast-moving teams of Shadow Guard would hunt the beasts, using hit-and-run tactics. The cost of this containment effort was high. We were losing men, and the constant fighting was a drain on our resources. Every chaos beast killed required the expenditure of valuable shadow steel arrows and alchemical grenades. The situation was unsustainable. I was fighting a war of attrition against an enemy that was literally being created out of thin air. I needed a permanent solution. I needed to wall off the entire zone. I drew up the plans for a new, massive construction project. The Great Ward. A circular wall 5 miles in diameter with the castle at its center. But this would not be a physical wall. It would be a magical one. The design was based on the village's ward, but on a much larger scale. It would require a network of 100 large warding stones, all powered by a central focusing crystal located in the Shadow Bastion. The resource cost was astronomical. 5,000 units of refined shadow ore, half our total strategic reserve. 20,000 units of magically treated ironwood, and the labor of my entire population for at least 6 months. This was the ultimate test of my burgeoning nation. It was a project on the scale of the pyramids. It would stretch our economy, our logistics, and our people to the breaking point. But it was the only way to contain the chaos I had unleashed. I presented the plan to my council. Kale, Boren, Alara, Finn, and Anna. They were shocked by the scale of it, by the sheer cost. Finn, my merchant, argued that it would bankrupt us. This was the first time my authority had been seriously questioned. My council was not made of mindless followers. They were smart, capable leaders, and they saw the immense risk in my plan. I had to convince them. I didn't use rhetoric or appeals to faith. I used data. I showed them the casualty rates from the chaos beasts. I showed them the projected resource drain from the containment effort. I laid out the numbers. The Great Ward was a massive upfront investment, but the cost of not building it, the slow bleed of men and resources over the next decade, was far higher. It was a choice between a painful surgery and a slow, certain death. They saw the logic. They understood the grim necessity of it. The council voted unanimously to approve the project. The face slap was a quiet one, a moment of dawning comprehension in the eyes of my most trusted advisors. The mobilization for the Great Ward project was total. Every able-bodied man and woman was conscripted into the workforce. The village became a giant labor camp. The Bastion became a factory, churning out refined ore and treated lumber. Our entire society was now geared towards this single, monumental goal. All other projects were put on hold. The expansion of our territory, the development of new trade goods, all of it had to wait. Survival came first. The first challenge was logistics. We had to transport thousands of tons of material to the construction sites around the Chaos Zone. Our hidden paths were not designed for this level of traffic. We had to build new, dedicated supply roads. But these roads would be visible. They would be a clear sign to any outside observers that a major power was operating in this region. We could no longer hide. This was a calculated risk. I was betting that the kingdom was still too preoccupied with its own economic crisis to investigate, and that the Order of the Black Sun was too busy regrouping after their defeat to launch a new offensive. The construction of the warding stones was Alara's greatest challenge. Each stone had to be perfectly carved and inscribed with complex runes. A single mistake would render the entire stone useless. He converted his entire forge into a production line. He trained a team of apprentices, the most skilled craftsmen from the village. They worked in shifts, 24 hours a day. The heart of our nation was the rhythmic sound of hammers on magical stone. While the physical construction was underway, I focused on the magical component. The training of my new mages at the Academy of the Void was progressing slowly. They were used to the cult's chaotic, sacrificial magic. My structured, systematic approach was alien to them. I had to break them down before I could build them back up. I stripped them of their ranks, their titles. They were all level 1 apprentices again. Their first lesson was not casting spells. It was meditation and magical theory. There was resistance. 3 of the more arrogant mages tried to challenge my authority, attempting to cast a forbidden spell in the training hall. The Bastion's internal security, a series of passive magical dampeners I had designed, shut them down instantly. Their punishment was swift and public. I did not execute them. I stripped them of their magic, using a painful but non-lethal ritual from the grimoire. They were now mundane, powerless. They became a living lesson to the other students. Discipline is paramount. The incident solidified my control over the academy. The remaining mages now understood. I was not their old high priest. I was not a fanatic. I was a scientist of magic, and I would not tolerate any deviation from my system. The project was taking its toll on our people. The work was hard, the hours long. Morale was beginning to fray. I had to intervene. I couldn't offer them more rest, but I could offer them a better future. I instituted a new system of rewards. Workers who exceeded their quotas were given better housing in the Bastion. Their children were given priority admission to the new village school I had established. I was using social engineering to drive productivity. I was creating a meritocracy. Your hard work would not just be rewarded in the afterlife. It would be rewarded here and now, with tangible benefits for you and your family. The new system worked. Productivity increased by 15%. The grumbling stopped. The people now saw the Great Ward not as a burden, but as an investment in their own future. A future where their children would be safe and educated. The first section of the ward was completed after 3 months of grueling labor. 25 of the 100 stones were in place. It was a major milestone. We held a small celebration, a moment of relief in the endless grind. But our progress had not gone unnoticed. A new player entered the game, a royal tax collector escorted by a full company of the king's own knights. The kingdom had finally taken notice of us. This was a far greater threat than the Baron. These were professional soldiers, loyal to the crown, and their leader was a knight captain, a man whose power level, according to my eye, was on par with Kael's. They were not here for a few pots. They were here to investigate the source of the economic disruption and the rise of a new, unsanctioned power in this barony. They were here to assess me. I met them not as a miracle boy, but as the de facto ruler of this territory. I wore a simple but well-made tunic, a shadow steel dagger at my belt. Kyle and 10 of his shadow guards stood behind me, their black armor a silent statement of power. The knight captain was a sharp, intelligent man. He was not fooled by my youth. He saw the discipline of my soldiers, the prosperity of my village, the massive construction project on the horizon. He saw a threat to the established order. The negotiation was a high-stakes game of poker. He demanded to know by what authority I ruled this land. I told him I ruled by the consent of the people, Wasiksak, who had been abandoned by their previous lord. He demanded I cease construction of the Great Ward, which he saw as an act of rebellion. I explained it was a defensive measure against a magical catastrophe, a catastrophe that had claimed the life of the previous baron. I was treading a fine line. I was asserting my authority without declaring open rebellion. I was framing myself not as a conqueror, but as a protector, a reluctant leader who had stepped up in a time of crisis. The knight captain was not convinced. He ordered his men to inspect the ward construction site. This was a critical moment. If they discovered the true nature of our magic, of our shadow ore, we would be declared enemies of the kingdom. I allowed the inspection. It was a calculated risk. I had already taken precautions. All Shadow Ore components were magically cloaked, using a low-level illusion spell taught to my new mages. The runes on the stones were disguised as simple decorative carvings. The knights found nothing. They saw a massive, well-organized construction project, but nothing that was overtly magical or treasonous. They saw a young, charismatic leader who was beloved by his people and was trying to protect them from a strange, natural disaster. The face slap was for the kingdom. They had sent their best investigator, and he had found nothing but a competent local administrator. I had used their own bureaucracy, their own rules of evidence against them. The knight captain was frustrated, but he had no legal grounds to act. He could not arrest a man for being a good leader. He left, but not before giving me a final warning. The king would be watching. I had won the encounter, but it had cost me. I had been forced to reveal my hand. The kingdom now knew about me. I was no longer an anonymous player. I was a named faction on the world map. This new status brought new problems. Refugees began to arrive at our gates. People fleeing the economic chaos in the rest of the kingdom, drawn by rumors of a prosperous, well-defended village in the north. At first, it was a trickle. A few families a week, but then it became a flood. Our population doubled in a month. This was a demographic crisis. We did not have the food, the housing, or the resources to support them. I had to make another hard choice. Turn them away, which was cruel but pragmatic, or accept them, which was compassionate but potentially suicidal. It was a classic city builder dilemma, population boom versus resource drain. I chose a middle path. We would accept the refugees, but they had to work. We established a processing center at the village gate. Every refugee was assessed for skills. Farmers were sent to our new agricultural projects. Craftsmen were sent to Alara's workshops. Laborers were sent to the Great Ward. We were turning a crisis into an opportunity. The refugee flood was a source of cheap labor and new skills. It allowed us to accelerate the construction of the ward and expand our industrial base. But it also brought new security risks. Spies could be hiding among the refugees. The Order of the Black Sun would certainly use this opportunity to infiltrate us. My internal security had to be upgraded. I created a new organization, the Watchers, an internal police force led by Lyra. Their job was to vet the refugees, to root out spies, and to enforce my laws. They were my secret police. Lyra, with her skills in stealth and observation, was perfect for the role. She recruited her own agents from among the most loyal and perceptive villagers. They became the silent, unseen guardians of our nation. The system worked. Within a month, Lyra's Watchers had identified and neutralized 3 cultist spies hiding among the refugees. The infiltrations were stopped before they could do any damage. Our society was becoming more complex, more stratified. We had a military, a government, a police force, a working class. We were no longer a village. We were a city-state, a nascent kingdom. The Great Ward was now 50% complete. The first 50 stones were in place, their foundations laid deep in the earth. The project was on schedule, but a new, unexpected threat emerged. The Chaos Beasts were evolving. They were no longer mindless amalgams. They were developing a crude intelligence, a pack mentality. They began to coordinate their attacks, to test our defenses. They were learning. The wild magic zone was not just spawning them, it was teaching them. It was a hyper-evolutionary incubator, and it was creating a new and terrifying ecosystem. Kale's forces were being pushed to their limit. The new tactics of the beasts were causing more casualties. Our Shadow Guard were elite, but they were not inexhaustible. We were losing the war of attrition. I needed a new weapon, a new type of unit that could counter the evolving threat. I turned once again to the grimoire. I was looking for a guardian, a creature that could patrol the border of the Chaos Zone tirelessly. I found it, the Obsidian Golem, a non-sentient construct of animated stone and magical energy. It was slow, but incredibly powerful and durable. It was the perfect defensive unit, a walking tower. The creation ritual was a feat of engineering, not summoning. It required a perfectly carved obsidian core, a complex array of runes, and a massive infusion of energy from a warding stone. Alara and my best mages worked for a week to create the first prototype. The cost was 100 units of ore and the full, temporary power of one of the new warding stones. It was an expensive experiment. The activation ritual was a success. The 8-foot-tall obsidian statue shuddered to life, its runic eyes glowing with a dull, red light. I had created my first automaton. I tested it against a captured chaos beast. The golem was a juggernaut. It ignored the beast's reality-warping attacks, its obsidian hide immune to the chaotic magic. It crushed the creature with a single, massive fist. This was the solution. I had my new unit. I immediately ordered the construction of a golem production facility within the Shadow Bastion. We would create an army of them. The cost was high, but the benefits were undeniable. The golems would replace my soldiers on the front lines of the containment effort. They would be my expendable, tireless guardians. My human soldiers would be preserved for the real war to come. With the golem army under construction and the Great Ward nearing completion, I felt a sense of cautious optimism. We had faced every crisis, every threat, and we had emerged stronger. But I knew the game was far from over. The Order of the Black Sun was still out there, gathering its forces. The kingdom was watching me with suspicious eyes. And the grimoire's prophecy about Cage, the Harbinger, was a dark cloud on the horizon. My little village had become a fortress. My people were safe, but I was no longer just fighting for their survival. I was fighting for the future of the entire world. The stakes had been raised to an unimaginable level, and the next move was mine. The aftermath of the final battle was not a celebration, but a period of intense consolidation. The Baron's lands were now mine, a territory encompassing 3 towns and over a dozen smaller villages. My domain had increased tenfold overnight. This victory brought a wealth of resources. The Baron's treasury yielded 3,000 gold coins, a significant boost to our finances. We captured his armory, adding 500 sets of standard steel armor and weapons to our inventory. The most valuable asset, however, was the land itself. Rich, fertile farmland that under my new economic model and with our advanced plows could produce a massive food surplus. My nation was now a potential breadbasket for the entire kingdom. I spent the first week integrating the new territories. I replaced the Baron's corrupt officials with my own administrators, men and women I had personally vetted and trained. Boren, my loyal warden, was instrumental in this process. There was resistance, of course. Some of the local merchants and minor nobles who had benefited from the Baron's rule tried to organize a rebellion. Lyra's watchers dealt with them quietly and efficiently. The rebellions were crushed before they could even begin. The common people, however, welcomed my rule. I abolished the Baron's oppressive taxes. I instituted a fair, flat tax of 10% on all profits. And I used that tax revenue to fund public works. Roads, granaries, and schools. This was a radical concept in this feudal world. A ruler who invested in his people. My reputation soared. I was not just a conqueror. I was a liberator. A reformer. My soft power was becoming as formidable as my military might. The Shadow Bastion was now a bustling hub of industry and research. Ilara's forges produced a steady stream of shadow steel and obsidian golems. My Academy of the Void was training a new generation of mages loyal to me. I also established a new department within the Bastion, the Department of Integration. Its purpose was to care for the rescued children. Anna was placed in charge, her role evolving from a simple medic to the head of a complex social program. We had to educate them, to heal their psychological wounds, and to help them control their latent magical abilities. They were not just victims, they were a resource. They were the future of my magical order. My power base was now a tripartite system. The village, my economic and agricultural center. The castle, my political and administrative capital. And the Shadow Bastion, my military and industrial heart. Each was a vital part of my growing machine. The system was stable, prosperous, and secure. I had achieved my initial goal. I had survived, and I had carved out a safe place for my people. But the game was far from over. New threats were already emerging on the horizon. Finn, my eyes and ears in the capital, sent an urgent message. The economic chaos I had caused had not gone unnoticed by the other great houses. They were forming a coalition, a trade alliance to counter the influence of the Blackwood Trading Company. This was a new kind of war, a war of monopolies and trade embargoes. They could not attack me militarily, but they could try to strangle me economically. I had to counter their move. I responded by diversifying. We began to export new products. The ironwood bows from our captured grove, the steel-strong spider silk from the forest caves, and our masterwork shadow steel weapons sold exclusively to the royal army. This move drove a wedge between the king and the noble houses. The king needed my weapons to deal with the unrest on his northern border. He would not support an embargo that cut off his supply of superior arms. I was now a player in the great game of national politics. The second threat came from the Order of the Black Sun. The high priest, under interrogation in the Bastion, had finally broken. He revealed the location of 2 other cultist cells operating in the kingdom. These were not research outposts. They were cells of assassins and spies, tasked with destabilizing the kingdom from within. They were a cancer. and I was the only one who knew where they were. I couldn't attack them directly. It would expose my hand to the king. I had to use a more subtle approach. I sent Lyra and a team of her best watchers, my new secret service, to hunt them down. It was a shadow war, fought in the back alleys and dark corners of the kingdom. Lyra's team, armed with my intelligence and Alara's advanced equipment, began to systematically dismantle the cult's network. This silent war was a constant drain on my resources and personnel, but it was necessary. I was protecting the kingdom from an enemy it did not even know it had. I was becoming its unwilling, unseen guardian. The third and most personal threat was the grimoire's prophecy about Kage, the Harbinger. I had spent months studying the ancient text, trying to understand what it meant. The grimoire was not a book of evil. It was a book of balance. It described the creatures of the void not as demons, but as a natural cosmic force, a force of entropy, of unmaking. Cage was not a scout for an invasion in the military sense. He was a symptom of a larger imbalance. The Order of the Black Sun, with their reckless use of void magic, were the ones calling his masters. They were pulling a thread that could unravel reality itself. My mission was not to fight Cage, but to restore the balance. To stop the cult before they did something irreversible. This new understanding changed my relationship with my familiar. He was not my pet. He was my partner, a fellow guardian against a greater threat. Our bond deepened. My control over his void abilities grew stronger. The system itself seemed to acknowledge this shift. A new notification appeared in my mind. Class evolution available. My summoner class could now evolve into one of 3 specializations. The first was Lord of the Horde, focusing on summoning large numbers of weaker creatures. The second was Titan Keeper, focusing on a single, powerful familiar like the Grove Titan. The third was Void Walker, a specialization focused on a single Void-type familiar, granting the summoner direct access to the Void's power. It was a path of immense power and immense risk. The choice was obvious. My entire journey had been defined by my connection to Kaja. I chose the path of the Void Walker. The evolution was immediate and painful. My body was flooded with the cold, silent energy of the void. My own magical signature changed, becoming a fusion of my human life force and the emptiness of space. I was no longer just a summoner. I was a part of the void itself. I gained new abilities. I could now use short-range teleportation myself, a skill I called Shadow Step. I could also create weapons of pure solidified shadow. My personal combat effectiveness had just increased by 1,000%. Cage also evolved. He was now larger, his 9 tails like rivers of pure darkness. He could no longer just step through the void. He could open small, temporary rifts in reality. He was a living portal. This power-up was a game-changer. We were now a force to be reckoned with on a personal level. I was no longer just a commander who hid behind his army. I was a frontline combatant. But this new power came with a terrible cost. The grimoire had a final warning for void walkers. The more you draw upon the void, the more it draws upon you. Lose control, and you will not just die, you will be unmade. I stood on the battlements of my castle, my new powers coursing through me. I was stronger than ever before. My nation was prosperous and secure. I had defeated my first major enemy. I had achieved local dominance. The former lands of the Baron were now the barony of the Void, a new, rising power in the kingdom. But my victory had placed me on a much larger stage. The great houses of the kingdom saw me as an economic rival. The Order of the Black Sun saw me as their greatest enemy, and the king saw me as a powerful but dangerously unpredictable vassal. And beyond them all, in the cold emptiness between the stars, a far greater threat was stirring. The imbalance was growing. The prophecy of the Harbinger was not a distant threat. It was a countdown. My victory was not an ending. It was the end of the beginning. I had won the tutorial. Now, the real game was about to start. My eye of the abyss scanned the horizon, and for the first time, it showed me a threat level it could not calculate. A question mark, the